Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Department of English, Prafulla Chandra College, Kolkata, I, Anuradha Mojumdar, extend a very warm welcome to you all to our international webinar today titled Apocalypse Narratives, Literature and Popular Culture. It is a moment of great pride and joy for us all to be able to hold this webinar rather, in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of a lockdown, and also because we have received an overwhelming number of responses to our call. So thank you so much for responding so enthusiastically to our webinar. Today's topic is the apocalypse, and as we might already be aware, most of us, many of us, that the word is of Greek origin, meaning to unravel or to uncover. And embedded in Judeo-Christian religious belief, the word also specifically refers to the end of the world as described in the book of Revelation in the Bible. However, the word has also moved away from its Judeo-Christian eschatological origins to refer now to more generally to any disaster of a cataclysmic scale, be it environmental disasters, be it nuclear holocausts, be it pandemics like the present one. And the other interesting fact about it is that the conceptualization of the end, an apocalyptic end, has also traditionally contained within itself the idea of new beginnings, the promise of renewal and rebirth, whether it be the linear, Judeo-Christian religious traditions like Christianity and Islam, or in the non-linear cyclical religious traditions like Hinduism that talks of decay and death followed by rebirth and regeneration. The end has also always contained the promise of a new beginning. So the speakers of our webinar would negotiate this dualistic, this layered and complex terrain of the apocalyptic imagination like comics and rock music. So we can only hope that the webinar is intellectually stimulating and also is downright interesting. So with this hope, we would now move on to the formal inaugural session of the webinar. And to this effect, I would like to request our respected principal, Dr. Ratnakar Pani, to say a few words on this occasion. Dr. Pani, could you please come and say a few words?
Hello. On behalf of Prafulla Chandra College, I thank you all for participating in this webinar organized by the Department of English in association with our IQAC. In this webinar, our main topic is apocalypse narratives, literature, and popular culture. We know in this virus in the sense that it locked us in our home. In this pandemic situation, I thank you, Angshuman and Anuradha, and our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Sonali Roy, to organize this type of webinar. You know, in this virus pandemic, most of our activities has been locked down. Now, what happens is that when we stop our activities, we are not affected from economic aspects, but also from social aspects. In the economic side, if you just look at the situation, people are starving, they have no job. Similarly, from our social side, if you look at the country, look at the world, we cannot even celebrate. Few days before, we can remember the Puri car festival. Lots of people gathered to celebrate it, but this year nobody came. There was a curfew. So, in this situation, today's topic, the pandemic that affect our culture, will be a really new dimension of discussion. So, I think it will give us much interest to know the new angle about the pandemic's impact on our society and culture. I again thank you all to join with us, and I hand over the mic to Anuradha. Anuradha, please.
Ma'am, please unmute.
Sorry for that. Thank you so much, sir, for your good wishes for our webinar and also for your kind words. I would now request Dr. Angshuman Mukhopadhyay, the head of the Department of English, to say a few words regarding this webinar and on this happy occasion for us. Angshuman, please.
Very good afternoon to all of you. I'm Dr. Angshuman Mukhopadhyay, Head of the Department of English, Prafulla Chandra College. I cordially welcome you all to this two-day international webinar on apocalypse narratives, literature, and popular culture. Given the situation that we are thrust into and the way we are compelled to accept several things as the new normal, the very first thing that occurred to us, that is the members of the department, that we wanted to organize a webinar to be in the thick of things, and the webinar was to be on a related issue, the issue that is bothering us right at this point in time the most, but didn't want to be exclusively on the pandemic as such. That's the reason why we chose this much broader canvas of apocalypse narratives, literature, and popular culture. Now, I can share my own understandings and my own observations regarding this in few sentences with you. The very first thing that I would like to suggest is that we have this kind of innate craving for the dystopic. And I think converting the utopic into the dystopic, or rather the dystopic, into the utopic, is our form of American dream. And why do we have this craving, this very strange craving for the dystopic, is that there is a very complex psychological and sociological response to it. And that's the reason why we have a plethora of discourses, both literary and non-literary, on the apocalyptic, the dystopic, and the disastrous as such. And the second thing that I would like to mention is that human beings in general, according to me, have a very short memory span. The moment there is a distance created between us and the things or the beings or the situations that we were engaged with or associated with, at certain point of time, we tend to forget those things. The images related or associated with those things start fading. And that's the time when we start thinking about literature or non-literary discourses to bring it in. And this disjuncture is also very, very vital, because this disjuncture creates the occasion for romancing the disaster. If it has not affected us in a very personal or intimate way, we actually start romancing it. And romancing disaster is, again, a form of urban fantasy, perhaps. I was reading a couple of months back Susan Sontag's The Imagination of Disaster, where she has written some very beautiful lines, and I would like to read a couple of lines from that particular essay. before I end this very brief introductory lecture, rather. She's writing, "Ours is indeed an age of extremity, for we live under continual threat of two equally fearful but seemingly opposed destinies, an unremitting venality and inconceivable terror." So on the one hand, we have the trap of banality. Whether we can call it a trap or not, that is a different question altogether. So on the one hand, we have this banality, this danger rather, and on the other hand, this inconceivable terror. And we have to try to negotiate between the two. And our position is precarious because we are somewhere in between trying to negotiate. And in the 4 lectures that we have lined up here, probably would be able to delve into, and I am sure that they will be delving into several dimensions of this polyvalent concept or the term of apocalypse. And be there with us on this journey. We'll be together, and I hope you are going to enjoy, as we are also going to enjoy thoroughly. Thank you very much. Anuradha, kindly introduce our Professor Arlene Ionescu, the keynote address of today's webinar. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Angshuman, for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm sure we would, most of us would agree that this is the perfect time to hold a kind of a webinar on the topic of apocalypse, and yet it is not quite on the virus or the pandemic as such, or nor on the lockdown. So yes, let's hope that we all enjoy this, the discussions that are lined up, and so we move on to the academic session of this webinar. It is my real pleasure to introduce to you all our keynote speaker for the day, Dr. Arlene Ionescu, Professor of English Literature and Critical Theory, Shanghai Jiaotong University. Apart from the fact that she has been professionally known to me for the last 4 years, I would also like to mention that she is a thoroughly graceful person and one of the most serious scholars that I have met in my academic career and professional career. And it's such a great pleasure to welcome you today, Arlene. Let me just briefly read a short bio note of Dr. Ionescu. Arlene Ionescu is Professor of English Literature and Critical Theory at Shanghai Jiaotong University. Her major research and teaching interests are in the fields of modernist prose and critical theory, memory studies, Holocaust studies, and trauma studies. She has published widely on James Joyce and other related aspects of modernism, on Maurice Blanchot, Jacques Derrida, Samuel Beckett, as well as on trauma in reputed academic journals such as James Joyce Quarterly, Memory Studies, Parallax, Partial Answers, Papers on Joyce, Joyce Studies Annual, Scientia Traductionists, and Slovo. She co-edited 5 issues of Word and Text, including one on post-classical narratology, 20 years later, co-edited with Lauren Millesi and Biwu Shan, that is forthcoming. Her books include Concordante Romano-Britanniese, 2004. I hope I pronounced it right, Arlene, I'm not sure. Romanian Joys, From Hostility to Hospitality in the year 2014. The Memorial Ethics of Lipskin's Berlin Jewish Museum, 2017. She co-edited with Maria Magaroni, Arts of Healing, Cultural Narratives of Trauma, published in the year 2020. As the recipient of the Research Prize Oriental Scholar 2020-2022, she is at present working with her PhD students on a project on the Shanghai Ghetto. So with these words, I would like to warmly welcome Arlene. Arlene, the virtual podium is all yours now. So could you kindly come and deliver the keynote address for our webinar today?
Okay. Thank you very much for this presentation, Anuradha, and my feelings are mutual. So I will start my speech by sharing the screen because there will be a PPT. Share. Does it work? My entire screen. So I can see I already have a problem with sharing the screen. Share screen. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet, Arlene.
StreamYard is sharing your screen, it
Yeah,
says.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay. Okay, great. So I will try to speak slowly because the connection may be unstable and maybe you can't hear me. So we start from the word apocalypse that Anuradha talked about as well. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, apocalypsis, which comes from the Greek apokalypsis, is both a noun, which means of action, and a verb, which means to uncover, to disclose. And this means, on the one hand, with capital initial, the revelation of the future granted to St. John in the Isle of Patmos. And on the other hand, by extension, any revelation or disclosure. The corresponding adjective, apocalyptic, coming from the same language, Greek, apokalyptikos, means of the nature of revelation or pertaining to the revelation of St. John, and can also mean relating to or characteristic of a disaster resulting in drastic, irreversible damage to human society or to the environment, especially on a global scale, and it can also be a synonym of cataclysmic. The book of Revelation from the New Testament, in which the term is recorded, introduces us into a world of a revengeful God. His wrath goes against the Jews in the Second Temple period at the end of the 1st century, and is seen by John the Apostle in the cave of his exile on the Greek island of Patmos, where he has a dream vision of the events God sends to people. War, famine, disease, epidemic, plagues, natural catastrophes like earthquakes, and asteroids hitting the earth, and the false prophet, the Antichrist, a dragon with horns in a lamb's skin, a beast, often designated by the symbolic 666, who would control the whole earth. The book of Revelation has both correspondences in some pre-Christian legends and myths, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to Matsya Purana's prophecy of the deluge from the Hindu Dharmasatra, as well as in other biblical stories such as Noah's Ark or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The literary imagination has retained such visions and apocalyptic fiction, what I call imagined apocalypse, evolved since the beginning of the 19th century, comprising works like the first retelling of the Book of Revelation, Jean-Baptiste Cousin de Grenville's epic poem in prose, which was called Le Dernier Homme, in English, The Last Man, published in 1805, followed by Mary Shelley's novel The Last Man in 1826, considered wrongly the first work of modern apocalyptic fiction, Edgar Allan Poe's short story The Conversation of Eros and Charmion in 1839, in which the two characters discuss in afterlife the destruction of the world brought by a comet that left only oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere and thus left behind a worldwide inferno. Other works that can be added, there are quite a few of them, but I will just mention a few, include Richard Jefferies' novel After London in 1885, set in a depopulated England where the few survivors return to a quasi-medieval way of life, and perhaps also two of H.G. Wells' novels, The Time Machine in 1895, in which the protagonist returns to the year 802,701 Anno Domini, after civilization has collapsed beneath a swollen red sun and humanity has split into the elfin Eloi and the brutal Morlocks, as well as The War of the Worlds by the same Wells, published in 1898, which depicts an invasion of Earth by Martians, adopted also by Orson Welles for a radio show, and has becoming one of the best-known early apocalyptic works, with other adaptations also in comic books, film, music, radio, television shows, as well as video games included. As we can see, all these apocalypse fictions are written in the aftermath of an imagined apocalypse and concentrate on survivors, witnesses to the imagined atrocious event that was recorded in the book. Apocalypse events are also natural or man-made environmental disasters caused by climate change, medical, such as plague or virus, whether natural or man-made as well, or imaginative, such as zombie or alien invasions. Creators coming from literature and film studies explored this as well, and there was a huge boom after 1900 when apocalyptic literature took extremely many facets, and this is quite impossible to deal with in a single paper. But as you can see on the screen, I tried to make a list. The list on the screen that you can see is a list in which I put the titles chronologically, but I'm trying also to make some sort of order looking at the themes, because the themes vary from alien invasions like Arthur Clarke's Childhood's Ends in 1953, Alice Sheldon's novelette The Screwfly Solution in 1977, Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide series that started in 1979 and ended in 2009, which is a humorous take on alien invasion stories, Gene Wolfe's The Earth of the New Sun in 1987, Greg Bear's The Forge of God in 1987, Sarah Antonio's Moonbane in 1989, Charles Pellegrino and George Zebrowski's novels The Killing Star, 1995. Then another possible theme would be astronomical apocalypses that describe solar cataclysms, comets, or meteorites that destroy the Earth. And here we can include Brian Aldi's novel Hot House in 1961, Beller's novel The Drowned World in 1962, Jerry Pournelle and Larry Niven's novel Lucifer's Hammer in 1977, Applegate's book series Remnants, which started in 2001 and ended in 2003. We may also include environmental disasters here, and for example, Kurt Vonnegut's novel Cat's Cradle in 1963 can be included here, as well as Beller's novel The Burning World 1 year later, 1964. Octavia Butler's novel Parable of the Sower, 1993. Another apocalypse can be caused by the failure of modern technology, and here we should include René Barjavel's novels Ravage, 1943, Fred Saberhagen's Empire of the East series written in the 60s and 70s, Steve Boyett's novel Ariel, but also comics. And I know that one of our speakers will speak about comic books. So perhaps the titles that I'm talking about will be included there. Garth Ennis Crossed, we started in 2008 and ended in 2010. And then the collective work of Robert Kirkman, Tony Moore, and Charlie Adler's The Walking Dead, which was published at the beginning of 2003 by Image Comics, and that ran its series for no less than 193 issues, with Kirkman unexpectedly ending the series in 2019. In field production, just a few titles, and I will stop with my list. The apocalyptic genre has boomed since the start of the Cold War, with films that present the emptied out cities of the Omega Men in 1971, from the American post-apocalyptic action film directed by Boris Sagal and starring Charles Heston as a survivor of a global pandemic, the barren wastelands of Mad Max in 1979, in a dystopian action thriller film directed by George Miller, produced by Byron Carandy and starring Mel Gibson. John Carpenter's Escape from New York in 1981, which imagines the entire island of Manhattan as a giant maximum security prison after a major war between the United States and the Soviet Union is concluding. That would be happening in the future, 1997. 28 days later, in 2002, which is a British post-apocalyptic horror film directed by Danny Boyle, that is set in a post-rage virus age after a group of misguided animal rights activists freed a caged chimp infected with what they call rage, a virus, and this escaped animal infects the whole city. Then the zombie overridden Dawn of the Dead in 2004, American action horror film directed by Zack Snyder and written by James Gunn, followed by Children of Men in 2006, a dystopian science fiction action thriller film directed and co-written by Alfonso Cuarón, or the computer animated science fiction romance film Wall-E 2008, which has set the template for what a ruined dystopian future might look like. Since the end of the Second World War, marked by such epoch-changing atrocities as the Holocaust and the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the notion of apocalypse has received a major, if ambiguous, role in various domains of the artistic production and critical or philosophical thinking, where witnesses this time wrote or created representations of what I call real apocalypses. And one such real apocalypse is the Holocaust. The Holocaust shares a semantic meaning with apocalypse, apokaluptein in Greek, and it is derived from the Greek holocauston, used in the Septuagint in the sense of totally consumed by fire, and linked to the Hebrew term for sacrificial offering, which is olach. The word Holocaust is usually extended from the stricter meaning of a religious burnt offering to a more general metaphor for sacrifice. What I call in my title real apocalypses may refer to events such as the Holocaust and the nuclear bombing, although many insisted that the former is unique. And you have here one quotation from Primo Levi from The Drowned and the Saved, where he said, I quote, "Notwithstanding the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the shame of the gulags, the useless and bloody Vietnam War, the Cambodian self-genocide, the desaparecidos in Argentina, and the many atrocious and stupid wars we have seen since, the Nazi concentration camp still remains an unicum, both in its extent and in its quality." An interesting debate on one of the zones of this apocalyptic world that Giorgio Agamben called Great Zone is that where during the Holocaust, the Sonderkommando, this was the team that the Nazi used by selecting prisoners from the camp to help in this awful industry of death. Acted. The mission of these selected people, who are always killed themselves after some months of working in this team, called with a euphemism special team, was to accompany the naked prisoner to the death. To their death in the gas chambers, to maintain order. Then after Cyclone B acted in the gas chamber to extract their corpses from the rooms and make sure the German state does not lose any valuables. They had to extract the gold teeth of the corpses to make sure no valuables were hidden in their orifices, cut the women's hair, burn the corpses inside the crematoria, and finally dispose the remaining ash. Levy saw in the very organization of these squads National Socialism's most demonic crime games. Since the Sonderkommando had privileges, if we can call them like that, one of the few survivors of this team, a witness of Hungarian origin, his name is Miklos Nisli, recounted that during their breaks in the factory of death, they were even forced to play football games with the Nazi officers. While many scholars saw this as an interruption of the crime and a moment of normalcy, Adorno saw it as a continuation of an uninterrupted massacre in the middle of an infinite horror. Like the witnesses, Adorno saw in this match the true horror of the camp. In the distant wake of these events, many philosophers were preoccupied with the notion of the end of the world. And I will take you through a few of these responses. Again, it is impossible to include them all here. And I will start for the text, No Apocalypse, Not Now, Full Speed Ahead, 7 Missives by Jacques Derrida, where he mentioned, I quote, "The nuclear age is not an epoch, it is the absolute epoche. It is not absolute knowledge and the end of history. It is the epoch of absolute knowledge. Literature belongs to this nuclear epoch, that of the crisis and of nuclear criticism, at least if we mean by this the historical and ahistorical horizon of an absolute self-destructibility without apocalypse, without revelation of its own truth, without absolute knowledge." French critic and writer Maurice Blanchot has a term which is called the literary space, which he conceived in relation to time, history, and death. As I showed in one of my previous texts, in Orpheus' Gaze, which was for Blanchot the center of the space of literature, Orpheus' mistake of looking back at Eurydice is equated to a form of apocalypse, which Blanchot called the ruin of the work, which is immediately undone. Eurydice returns to darkness because the legendary musician and poet betrayed the work and Eurydice and the night, as he desired not to make Eurydice live, but to have living in her the plenitude of her death. This return opens the space which was defined by Nicolas Royle as night writing, a space which Blanchot relates to obscurity in another text of his which is called Infinite Conversation. In the work of Fire, it takes the form of the search of the abyss, Lazarus in the tomb. And in the writing of the disaster, it takes the form of the ultimate historical disaster, the Holocaust. In an essay entitled The Absolute Event of History, the Shoah and the Outside, published in an issue on Blanchot Spaces that I co-edited, Kevin Hart showed that as early as the writer's silence, which was in April 1941, Blanchot had pointed out that in the post-war era, it appears to many people that the thinking to be found in great books or great canvases is heretical and conflicts with the wisdom of these times given over to disaster and turmoil. Of course, the very text to talk about with Blanchot is the text which was his most important response to the apocalypse, L'écriture du désastre, the writing of the disaster, which is Blanchot's maturity work dealing with the Holocaust and which engages with issues of trauma, representation, and the task of writing in a post-Shoah world. He calls le désastre, disaster. So the total light that Blanchot sees when the falling of the star, the aster, occurs. For Blanchot, light breaks forth, the burst of light, the dispersion that resonates or vibrates dazzlingly, and in clarity clamors, but does not clarify. The breaking force of light, the shattering reverberation of a language to which no hearing can be given. And here is the perhaps most important quotation in the book, where we can see Blanchot's apocalypse that delivers its shattering truth in a silence only illuminated by history's absolute all-burning that leaves nothing in its wake but its own ashes. And I read, "The Holocaust, the absolute event of history, which is a date in history, that utter burn where all history took fire, where the movement of meaning was swallowed up, when the gift, which knows nothing of forgiving or of consent, shattered without giving place to anything that can be affirmed, that can be denied, gift of very passivity, gift of what cannot be given. How can thought be made the keeper of the Holocaust, where all was lost, including guardian thought? In the mortal intensity, the fleeing silence of the countless cry." Blanchot's falling of the star implies the necessity to go beyond the phenomenology, and mention should be made that phenomenology ultimately comes from phos, light, phenomenology being thus the science of what appears in the light. According to Blanchot, the space of the disaster could bring about the only perspective from which one can speak about the Holocaust, admitting his impossibility to know. Hart's article, on which I started, questions passionately but also forensically whether fragmentary writing responds adequately to the horror of Shoah and gives an account on the way Blanchot approached the apocalypse that he names disaster. He finds what he calls fragments about calm. Blanchot plays on the root calma, which comes from Old Spanish, which means heat of the day, and hence indirectly might allude to the burning of corpses in the extermination camps. He adds, when Blanchot evokes the Shoah, he does not always use the word disaster, and replaces it with apocalypse, giving the example of the essay which was named Thinking the Apocalypse. He does not do the same in another text which is called Do Not Forget. In Do Not Forget, Blanchot coined the notion of the immemorial, a concept that reveals that once a disastrous event, an apocalypse, occurs, it is forever lost. And this is something I also dealt with in my monograph, The Memorial Ethics of Libeskind's Berlin Jewish Museum, where I showed that the immemorial, a notion that mainly Blanchot and Jean-François Lyotard used, is intractable residue that at once calls for and defies historical knowledge and memory, that cannot be remembered or forgotten. The sum total of all the incommensurables and unrepresentables that always risk petrifying into silence once the historian compels his interlocutor, the witness, to relate faithfully what happened. The immemorial comprises all those traumatic events of history which cannot be translated into shareable narrative memories and are consigned to silence. Lyotard's most sustained elaborations of discontinuous thinking of the immemorial appeared in one of his books, which was called Heidegger and the Jews, where he showed that the immemorial can neither be remembered, so represented to consciousness, made the object of a present representation, nor forgotten, thus obliterated, consigned to oblivion. A thinking that remembers that there is always a forgotten that remains unthought as well as unthinkable. The war cry, rounding off the appendix to the postmodern condition, to be witnesses to the unpresentable, then to bear witness to the different in his eponymous project, The Different, was rephrased as the duty of thought and writing to the immemorial, to the forgotten, and to the unrepresentable after Auschwitz, a thinking to which Lawrence Langer subscribed as well. In his evocatively titled Holocaust Testimonies, The Ruins of Memory, Langer suggested that the very impossibility of accessing past sufferings could be erected as a safeguard against its attempted reimagining and reintegration into the world outside. Adorno's prohibition on representation in the aftermath of Auschwitz and his famous words, which were so many times misquoted, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, are often misinterpreted, since it did not refer to an indictment of the whole of culture, but to what he thought was barbaric in it. And he said, the first quotation on the slide, cultural criticism finds itself faced with the final stage of the dialectic of culture and barbarism. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, and this corrodes even the knowledge of why it has become impossible to write poetry today. Later on, Adorno reiterated his position in a text from 1962, which is called Commitment, within a discussion opposing autonomous art to Sartre's notion of committed literature from what is literature, where he said, I have no wish to soften the saying that to write lyric poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. It expresses in negative form the impulse which inspires committed literature. And then in 1966, in Negative Dialectics, however, the German philosopher retracted a slightly reworded version of this affirmation, conceding that, I quote, perennial suffering has as much right to expression as a tortured man has to scream. Hence, it may have been wrong to say that after Auschwitz you could no longer write poems, unquote. A more nuanced explanation came in Zur Dialektik von Heiterkeit in 1968, published 1 year later. In its English translation, Is Art Light-Hearted? Where he had the following statement. The statement that it is not possible to write poetry after Auschwitz does not hold absolutely, but it is certain that after Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was possible and remains possible for the foreseeable future, light-hearted art is no longer conceivable. This was my own engagement with the difference between imaginary and real apocalypses, and I hope I made my points clear. So in the following part, without aspiring to presenting to exhaustive examples, I will just endeavor to offer to our listeners some instances of how both imaginary and real apocalypses were represented in philosophy, literature, architecture, and films. I will choose a few examples. And since I may work in China, but I am a Romanian by origin, I will first present an apocalypse which some of our listeners may be less familiar with. It is the apocalypse imagined by the Romanian-born French philosopher Émile Cioran. And then I will refer to the bare space of Samuel Beckett's plays and fiction. Then I will refer to the apocalyptic space of Daniel Libeskind's Holocaust Tower. I will give you 2 examples of real apocalypses in film studies. And after a commentary on 9/11, I will also end on a short reflection on the kind of apocalypse. Is it real? Is it imagined? We are living through right now. So I return to Cioran, very connected to the breaking force of the light of the disaster that Maurice Blanchot spoke about, is the Romanian-born French philosopher Émile Cioran's demonic light from his book, which is called On the Heights of Despair. Here he imagines the last day, the day on which people, irrespective of their social or personal status, gather in the streets, refusing to do anything anymore. For Choran, this is the day of the apocalypse, the day when slaves give up their senseless work, when the trappings of ordinary life are allowed to burst once and for all. This is the day when those who suffered in silence finally make an effort to yell with all their might, making a strange, menacing, dissonant clamor that would shake the earth. Nature partakes of this apocalyptic vision, with waters flowing faster and mountains swaying threateningly, with trees showing their roots like an eternal and hideous reproach, birds croaking like ravens, and animals scattering in fright and fall from exhaustion. This is the time when the void, and here I mark Choran's words, let ideals be declared void, he says, comprises everything but ironic approximations, beliefs, trifles, art, a lie, and philosophy, a joke, climaxes and anti-climaxes, the time when all phenomena change form and become evanescent, vanish before us, engraved in oblivion. And this is the first quotation. Let lumps of earth leap into the air and crumble in the wind. Let plants make strange arabesque, frightful and distorted shapes in the sky. Let wildfire spread rapidly and a terrifying noise down out everything so that even the smallest animal would know that the end is near. In this void, the light produced by the wildfires shimmers with vertical reflections, creating a space between the outside of the world that dissolves in the philosopher's self. Through the insistent contact of this light with death, humanity estranges itself from effect. Held in a syncopal temporality, in a convulsive manner, the apocalypse pulverizes its identity, disperses it into perdition and nothingness. And here is the second quotation. Let all form become formless, and chaos swallow the structure of the world in a gigantic maelstrom. Let there be tremendous commotion and noise, terror and explosion, and then let there be eternal silence and total forgetfulness. And in those final moments, let all that humanity has felt until now, hope, regret, love, despair, and hatred, explode with such a force that nothing is left behind. With On the Heights of Despair, Choran almost triumphantly announced that he had engineered the end of the world in obscurity, invisibility, that melt into an unknown death. He says, let history crumble into dust. The author himself disintegrate into dust. And this is the final quote. I would like to explode, float, crumble into dust, and my disintegration would be my masterpiece. I would like to melt in the world, and for the world to melt orgasmically in me, and thus in our delirium to engender an apocalyptic dream, strange and grandiose, like all crepuscular visions. The second example I want to refer to is the work of Samuel Beckett. According to Simon Critchley, in Very Little, Almost Nothing, Beckett's work leaves us open on the void, open on the nothing. And as you can see, this is the title of this slide. Much of Beckett's work can be read as an implacable transposition of emptiness and finitude. His plays, as well as his novels, provide allegorical tableaus of an abyssal existential vacuity. The time of cloth and ham, like the time of Vladimir and Estragon, is a time of impending disaster. Adorno considered that in Endgame, characters voice the certainty that there really is not so much to be feared anymore, which made the German philosopher recognize in Beckett's art the only fitting reaction to the situation of the concentration camps, a situation he never calls by name, as if it were subject to an image ban. In Them to Fame, Nolson, who is Beckett's biographer, identified the message of the play as one of the unrelieved despair at the hopeless and futility of life. In one of his frequent turnings of the telescope on the auditorium, then on the without, Clove returns the finding that all is zero, corpsed, a nihilistic vision that is fittingly representative of Beckett's final view of life's journey in a December 1989 interview, as worth, I quote, precious little, unquote. Beckett's play Not I, first performed in 1972 at the Lincoln Center in New York, which is displayed mid-stage and surrounded by total darkness, utters snatches of inconsequential words, broken up by suspension words, suspended, as in the ironic undertones of deportation in Clove's I see a multitude in transports of joy. Beckett's figures are self-divided, not eyes, who experience different forms of amnesia because they would rather forget, because they cannot remember, even if, like crap, they rewind the reel of their lives' distant memories until the tape runs on in silence at the very end of this one-man, one-act play. Estragon periodically needs reminding about the imminent appointment that he and Vladimir have with Godot, even though it is assumed to be a life-defining event, and their earliest exchanges are punctuated by either Gogo or Didi exclaiming, "Nothing to be done," or other such variations. In Andrew Kennedy's view, Krupp's spoken text eliminates all dialogue, just as his existential situation terminates a relationship, turning him into a split soliloquist who displays at least two voices and rhythms. Beckett's late prose also contains, among many other titles, How It Is, where Beckett informed us the words belonged to the narrator who was alone in the dark in a post-apocalyptic world, his face lying down on an endless plain of mud, crawling from west to east with his sack of tins, a fish, and a tin opener. Yet the voice of that narrator, Beckett claimed, was someone else's coming from somewhere else. The narrator would act like a sort of medium who would recite someone else's voice that possessed him. In part 2 of How It Is, the reader encounters Pim carrying his own sack across the mud, the figure tortured by the narrator who forces him to speak by scratching him with his fingernails until he bleeds and gouging him with his tin opener. Pim would sing, would quote the words that were carved into his skin by the narrator. And you have the words on the screen. Past moments, old dreams, back again, or fresh like those that pass, or sings always, and memories, I say them as I hear them, murmur them in the mud, in me, that were without, when the panting stops, scraps of an ancient voice in me, not mine. My life, last state, last version, ill-said, ill-heard, ill-recaptured, ill-murmured, in the mud, brief movements of their lower face loses everywhere. Beckett always renders characters' metaphysical anguish at the absurd human condition, at the inexorable decline of once happy lives and aspirations gone sour, and would be shrouded by the minimalist darkness, which in so many Beckett plays stages vacuity and sparseness through the bead-ridden like Malone or Mr. Kelly, the chair-bound like Ham, the ash-binned like Nag and Nell, the half-buried like Winnie, castaways and creepers like Clove, the master persecutors like Pozzo and Ham, and mindless perpetrators who, like Malone, can impassively wonder, and you have the quotation, how many have I killed, hitting them on the head or setting fire to them? Offhand, I can only think of 4, all unknowns. I never knew anyone. All those who have made self-annihilation their permanent abode, those entrapped in servile dependency as ersatz for free, fulfilling relationships, those oblivious to the world and others who suffer from unimaginable angst, yet are shielded by a passivity which acts as a carapace of self-defense against emotions and the numbing of desires. All these yearn for a terminal solitude, emptiness, nothingness, meaninglessness, silence, which are in Stanley Cavell's words, not their givens, but their goal, their new heroic undertaking. Once we have perpetrated into this void of Beckett's creation, only God could deliver us from its nothingness. But God, like Godot, as Estragon tells us in Waiting for Godot, has absconded, and Lucky tells us, metes out justice randomly. And this is, if you remember the play Waiting for Godot, from the famous speech that Lucky has when he's ordered by his master to think. And he says, given the existence of a personal God outside time, without extension, who from the heights of divine apatheia, divine athambia, divine aphasia, loves us dearly, with some exceptions, for reasons unknown, and suffers with those who for reasons unknown are plunged in torment. So with this divine apathy, his speechlessness, aphasia, and his lack of the capacity for terror or amazement, athambia, the God of whom Lucky speaks is a God who does not communicate with us, cannot feel for us, and condemns us for reasons unknown. After all, he may have died in Auschwitz, as Levinas and others claimed, like Elie Wiesel or even Primo Levi sometimes. But if he did not, and if he somehow presided over the catastrophe, the real apocalypse, then God is a witness that cannot be sworn. In my exploration of Beckett's Apocalypse, I finish with Text for Nothing, a sort of entrapment without an enclosed space, where movement away is dangerous to the self, being opposed by early objects, and stasis is encasing. And Wordsworth Hoe, Beckett's penultimate, most complex, irreducible prose piece, voicing reiterated failures to such an extent that he admitted defeat when he attempted to translate it into French. You may know that Beckett was always self-translating his own works. If they were written in English, he translated them in French, and if they were written in French, he translated them in English. Say a body were none, no mind were none, that at least a place were none, for the body to be in, move in, out of, back into. No, no out, no back, only in, stay in, on, in, still, all of old, nothing else ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. In this realm of failing better, morphology and syntax crumble to dust into darkness, as language undergoes a sort of Götterdämmerung without issue. And we have the second quotation, less seen, less seeing, less seen and seeing when with words than when not, when somewhat than when now how, stare by words dimmed, shades dimmed, voice dimmed, dimmed, all there as when no words, as when no how, only all dim, till blank again, no words again, no how again, then all undimmed, stare undimmed, that words had dimmed. Quite a few scholars have equated Beckett's world with nothingness, yet this sort of nothingness is neither specifically nihilism, according to Adorno, nor Critchley's slight inflection of it, by steadfastly refusing to mean something. Beckett's work refuses nihilism and gives an indication of the transformative ethical and political practice from which it abstains. It is rather the ironically omnipresent sense of meontological emptiness through Beckett's Text for Nothing, to the point that nothing is more real than nothing. One need only to think of the pairing of what, Mr. Not, or else of the stock phrase rewritten in the stunning one-liner opening Murphy. The sun shone, having no alternative, on the nothing new. Beckett pushes language to its limits and breaking point until it borders on madness and on what Laura Salisbury called aphasic disintegrations, caused by the aphasic symptom that brings language and subjectivity to confrontation with the constitutive force of their outside. For Anne Banfield, Beckett's madness consists of thematic and linguistic reduplication ad infinitum, with the aim of rehashing nothing new by making radically apparent its repetitive nature in carrying these processes to absurd lengths. Another critic assimilates Beckett's view of art with probing the unintelligible, the unpredictable, the nothingness of experience that point to the extremity of human suffering, the depths to which we are capable of descending. Beckett grinds language to the point of depletion and exhaustion, or as Hélène Sixou comments on Deleuze's famous study of Beckett's language and stagecraft, The Exhausted, I quote, Beckett is in the role of the exhauster of the exhausting, that is to say, of the inexhaustible, and more precisely, the exhauster of all the inexhaustibles, one after the other. The next example is from the Jewish Museum, as you could hear from Anuradha's presentation. This is a museum about which I wrote a book in 2017, and I'm presenting what is called the Holocaust Tower from this museum. Architect Libeskind's vision and reconceptualization of space in the Berlin Jewish Museum redefined what we know as apocalyptic space when he constructed the Holocaust Tower as a part of the museum, the appendix that ends what is called inside the museum the axis of the Holocaust. This tower is a 24-meter tall empty concrete silo, which was defined by Libeskind himself as a voided void. The tower is the epitome of a European nightmare that started with the pogroms and the anti-Semitic edicts, which did not only begin in 1933, but rather became obvious, irrefutable, and unfortunately irreversible in 1933. Then went on with the burning of books and cultural artifacts, and ended with the burning of human beings, all of which gave Libeskind the feeling of nothingness of the nothing. As pointed out by David Ellison, the space of the tower, even more than the other voids in the museum, is acoustically and climatically distinct from the rest of the building and is devoid by of any aesthetic claims. For Rolf Schneider, it is as it is, huge, narrow, and you can see the image, cut off, final, bare. There is no aesthetic equivalent for Holocaust. There is nothing aesthetic about this enclosed space. It is the Holocaust itself, which is exactly what Adorno's prohibition on representation of the post-Auschwitz era was about. In the tower, in the antechamber of death, whose sense of hopelessness is mitigated by the filtering light, the visitor comes face to face with himself, herself, in sheer emptiness. It is apocalypse that the visitor of the museum witnesses. In Breaking Ground, Libeskind spoke of a vision while discussing how the story of a survivor from Yafa Eliach Hasidic tales of the Holocaust inspired him to build the Holocaust Tower. In one of these tales, Elaine, a survivor who later lived in Brooklyn, explained how the vision of a white line of sky glimpsed through the slats of the boxcar kept her alive during her 2 horrible years in Struthof concentration camp, after she was transported from Auschwitz in a group of around 20,000 Jews. Libeskind returned to this story in an interview entitled The End of Space, as well as in a lecture held in Berlin in 1997 in relation to the vision, which one needs to have in order to survive. The woman had held onto that white line, which she had seen on the horizon, a line that later on, while in Brooklyn, years after the war, she realized must have been the trail of an airplane. In the architect's view, what mattered was that the line really was there and not its origin. It is to hold on, he says, let's say, to that white line. It is the mystery of survival. And you can see that he constructed the tower exactly in this way, because during the day, in spite of the fact that it is completely dark, you can see that light. It was thus Libeskind's belief that in Struthof in 1944, the singular vision had a significance which was surely obscure and enigmatic, and yet it had to transform memory and communication of an experience. At the beginning of this paper, I mentioned the total light of the disaster, le désastre, the falling of the aster that Blanchot saw when the falling of the star aster occurs. For Blanchot, light breaks forth, I said. So did for Elaine, but it did not mean the darkness, only the darkness of the apocalyptic world she lived in for 2 years, but also that light that you can see on the screen, the feeble hope that that made her a survivor. And I will go on with the what I call real apocalypses, not imagined apocalypses this time, in film studies. I'm sure the other speakers will speak about other films because these are my own, let's say, subjective selection, and they are not classified as apocalypse films. I will refer first to 1959 film made by Marguerite Duras and Alain Resnais, which is called Hiroshima Mon Amour, that takes as protagonists two reluctant survivors of the massive post-World War trauma inflicted on both victors and the defeated. So the man is a Japanese architect who has survived the loss of his family and the obliteration of his native city after the US atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the woman is a French actress who has come to Hiroshima to participate in a film about peace, but who carries with her memories of Nazi occupation and the loss of her lover, who was a German soldier in Neve, the disgrace and madness imposed on her and her family after liberation, and her confinement in a cellar for almost 1 year. Maria Margaroni details Duras' intentions when writing the script of the film. I quote, "If love has any chance, this can only erupt in Hiroshima, the devastated place, the brutal event, the unnameable name for the monstrosity that inhabits the human." As she emphasizes, her aim in the film is not the description of horror by horror, but what she calls the miracle of a resurrection. And the other example I want to take is the 1985 film made by Claude Lanzmann, Shoah, that totalized 9 hours and resulted from Lanzmann's work for 11 years, that contained the interviews with survivors, witnesses, and perpetrators that he conducted in the many visits to 4 sites across Poland. I would like just to tell you that the film starts with a boat trip on the Polish Jew threatening, singing in a rowboat, similarly to how he had serenaded his captors, and he was only one of the 2 survivors of Treblinka. The scene introduces us to a post-apocalyptic world in which not only victims speak, but also perpetrators like Corporal Franz Suchomel, an SS officer who had worked at Treblinka, who agreed to be interviewed on condition he is not filmed. Lanzmann used hidden recording equipment while assuring Suchomel that his name would not be used. Suchomel minutely detailed his work at Treblinka. So this is real apocalypse, saying that he did not know it was an extermination camp until he arrived there. On his first day, he said he vomited and cried after encountering trenches full of corpses, 6-7 meters deep, with the earth around them moving in waves because of the gases. The smell of the bodies carried for kilometers depending on the wind, he said, but local people were scared to act in case they were sent to the work camp. The last example is 9/11, which was for Giovanna Boradori the unthinkable that broke out of a glorious late summer morning with inexplicably turned into something close to apocalypse. And this is something I think all of us saw on TV, alive, on the 11th of September 2001, watching the news of the terrorist attack against the World Trade Center, dumbfounded like so many millions of viewers. I was struck by the apocalyptic spectacle, which reminded me exactly of Emile Cioran's imagined apocalypse, invocation of smoke and dust as after a great cataclysm, which I presented earlier on. On what became universally known henceforth as 9/11, New York City, enveloped in the smoke, dust, and debris, experienced the real trauma of a real skyscraper's catastrophe. The dust from the collapsed Twin Towers was to require innumerable meanings in the months to follow. In Marita Sturcan's view, this dust was initially a shocking substance for Americans, something otherworldly, unexpected, uncanny, yet also strangely familiar. Some of it contained recognizable scraps, papers, remnants of the ordinary business of life before that day, now transformed, balance sheets from financial firms, previously objects of mundane business transactions, were transformed into historical objects, materials of poignancy and loss. If in the first few days after 9/11, the urgency was to find survivors among the rubble, when confronted with the blunt fact that there was no more lives to save, the families of the disappeared then realized that there were no bodies to bury either. In the absence of victims' remains, the dust became some kind of corporeal presence to mediate the absence of a loved one. Marita Sturcan writes that in October 2001, Mayor Giuliani set up a procedure through which each of the families of the dead received an urn of the dust from the site for a memorial ceremony. This dust was gathered into 55-gallon drums, blessed by a chaplain at Ground Zero, and given a police escort to one police plaza. Their officials scooped the dust into bags, which they held in gloved hands. Each family was then given a 5-inch urn of dust with 9/11/01 engraved on it, wrapped in a blue velvet bag. The ritual formula from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer Burial Service, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, itself derived from Genesis 3:19, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it was thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return, had seldom been put to such a morbid, literal application. One of the collateral impacts of 9/11, by the way, was the inauguration of the Berlin Jewish Museum with the Holocaust Tower that I showed you before, which was scheduled for that very day and that had to be postponed. The risk of other possible terrorist attacks spreading to Europe was deemed too high, and as a safety precaution, the museum, a long-awaited, already famous symbol and landmark, was opened to the public only 2 days later. In an attempt to understand what is specific about 9/11, Carl Goodkin states that the terrorist attacks forced us to focus on bereavement and the associated sense of loss or grief as they occur on a much larger scale. Goodkin's analysis establishes the link between personal feelings of loss and the collective experience of grief in order to approach the phenomenon and full impact of mass bereavement on such an occasion. Whereas it is said to refer to the actual life event of learning that someone close to you has died, the response of grief is the specific form of distress we suffer during the process of adapting to the occurrence of it, which can be aligned with the conception of mourning both in Freudian psychoanalysis and trauma studies, and the necessity to come to terms with it through a process of memorialization. On a cloudless morning, the 2 airplanes crashed, one after another, into the twin-towered World Trade Center that used to dominate the Manhattan skyline, killing 2,602 people inside the towers, the 87 passengers who were on board Flight 11, and the 60 passengers on Flight 175. Owing to the sheer scale of human destruction and the event's unprecedented, exceptional character, 9/11 soon came a date endowed with symbolic enormity. The targeting of the emblematic building of the New York City's economic power and the attack of the integrity of the United States of America were among the attributes that turned that day's nightmarish scenario into a construction that seeks to overshadow perhaps all recent international traumas and certainly all other US traumas and the sites of shocks. Responding to a series of questions on the subject of 9/11 and global terrorism, Habermas explained that he did not see the monstrous act itself of destroying the symbols of American pride as something new because of the action of the suicide hijackers who transformed the fully fueled airplanes together with their hostages into living weapons, or even the unbearable number of victims and the dramatic extent of devastation, but rather because of the symbolic force of the target struck. The collapse of the tallest buildings in Manhattan meant the destruction of an icon into the household image of the American nation. Meant as a powerful symbolic attack on Western democracy, spreading destruction and division, 9/11 ironically brought together side by side for the first time the two antithetical visions of philosophy represented by Derrida and Habermas. Deconstruction, systematic critique of reason versus a defense of rationality, modernity, and the legacy of the Enlightenment. Although, as Boradori recounts, they were scheduled to come to New York separately and through unrelated channels, in a few weeks' time, the apocalyptic event prompted an unprecedented dialogue between the two of the greatest living voices of the European philosophical tradition. And we have two quotations here. In his dialogue with Giovanna Boradori a few months after 9/11, Jürgen Habermas mentioned that the monstrous act itself was new. And I quote, "And I do not mean the action of the suicide hijacker who transformed the airplanes together with their hostages, and this is part of what I said before, but the unbearable meaning on the American nation." You heard this quotation partly before. For Derrida, 9/11 was a trauma and thus an event whose temporality proceeds neither from the now that is present nor from the present that is past, but from the impresentable to come, what he calls avenir, a weapon, wounds and leaves forever open an unconscious scar. But this weapon is terrifying because it comes from the to come, from the future, a future so radically to come that it resists even the grammar of the future anterior. Imagine that the Americans, and through them the entire world, has been told what has just happened, the spectacular destruction of the two towers, the theatrical but invisible deaths of thousands of people in just a few seconds, is an awful tiling, a terrible crime, a pain without measure. But it's all over. It won't happen again. There will never be again anything as awful as or more awful than that. I forgot to show you this quotation, which I just read for you. And we are together in this online conference rather than seeing one another face to face in a room, as we are precisely living through pandemic times. This small particle of virus, COVID-19, seems to have changed our life forever. Many pandemics, like the Spanish flu 100 years ago, have been the material for work on apocalypses. We are perhaps living now an apocalypse, or as Mitchell, the editor of Critical Inquiry, a reputed international journal which hosts a blog with responses to these times we are living in, named it nothingness. We could see, I quote, how deep nothingness can be, a black hole in time that has sucked the entire world into its gravitational field. From our armchairs, we, workers from all fields, have become hardworking Zoomers, or now streamliners, involved in distance learning and e-learning, online teaching, virtual classrooms, the whole bewildering turmoil, to which we add today one more webinar. In these apocalyptic times, as Chiara Capelletto rightly pointed out, we witness the transformation of public space into media space, the virtualization of private space through the systematic use of online platforms and new codes of social representation. On Zoom, by the way, only the upper half of our body is displayed. Yet after each apocalypse, imaginary or real, as I name them here, I would like to point out that healing is still possible. I may be a specialist in trauma studies, yet I also co-edited a book named Arts of Healing, Cultural Narratives of Trauma, to which I would like to come back at the end of this presentation. There, I and my co-editor, Maria Margaroni, had pleaded for a return to the resources of the humanities in an attempt to investigate, reflect on, remember, or imagine old and new arts of healing at the intersection of critical and cultural theory, psychoanalysis, philosophy, neurology, literature, the visual arts, film studies, and gender and queer studies. We believe that there is an urgent need for the critical humanities to give up an overgeneralized concept of trauma, which subsumes all forms of violence, dislocation, and psychic pain under its categoric singularity. And on this strong belief, my presentation ends, and thank you. So that's it.
Yes, Arlene, thank you so very much for such an engaging presentation, so intellectually stimulating. The range was epic as usual. I'm not surprised, and it was such a beautiful presentation. As of now, I haven't seen many questions coming from from the side of the audiences, and more importantly, due to technical glitches, Ria Banerjee of our department, who was supposed to take the questions, have been unable to sort of log in to this. I'm not sure whether she would be able to right now. So let me just quickly ask a question that just came into my mind. I'm just kind of curious. It's not that it is a full-fledged question, but while you were talking of the Romanian philosopher Emil Cioran, with which we are not really very familiar with, you were talking about the way the philosopher author wants to disintegrate into the world, and how he wants all emotions like hatred and love and other things, to explode. And yet, he calls this disintegration his masterpiece. I don't know whether I got you right, Arlene, but I think that is what you said. So obviously here we are talking in terms of an imagined apocalypse, if I'm not mistaken, when we are talking of Emil Cioran. So I'm just sort of curious, are there any specific circumstances leading to such a nihilistic imaginative leap on behalf of Cioran in his, in his writings? I mean, we are not very sure, of the times that he was writing in his dates and stuff. So could you kindly throw a little more light on that? Because I'm really curious to know why such nihilism on his part.
Well, he was writing this a few years after he had a scholarship in 1936, 1937 in Berlin, when Hitler was ascending to power more and more, and when his policies were put in place. And Cioran, like many other Romanian intellectuals at that time, were not very much aware of the danger. It's a bit similar to what was happening in France, for instance, with other great names, or to what was happening in Germany with Heidegger. And this is a time when they did not commit themselves any sort of crime, of course, but they supported the ascension to power of the Nazi. So this is the time when Cioran was writing his book, and he was a philosopher who was very promising, and this is his second major book. After writing 4 books, he left Romania for France, and he never returned, and he shifted to French. And this is why he is much more known as a French philosopher. The French say that he's a French philosopher, but I would say he's a Romanian-born French philosopher who became a real important name for the 20th century philosophy. So He's generally included into any sort of book that deals with 20th century philosophy in what they call French philosophy. And while he changed not only the language in which he wrote, so he shifted from Romanian to French, he also changed his name, and perhaps this is why you are not familiar, because as a French philosopher, he signed like this, E.M. Choran, and he's known in French as Cioran. And this EM does not come from Émile Michel, as the Library of Congress wrongly lists him, but it was just a name that he made up on the spot, thinking of becoming somebody anonymous about nobody would know anything, including his Nazi past, of course, fascist past.
Okay. Thank you so much for the explanation. That really explains, because I was really wondering. As of now, I don't see any questions coming. So I would like to find out if Ria wanted to ask something, because I thought that Ria was trying to ask a question.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are, Ria.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Professor UNESCO for such an enlightening session. The one question that I had was, she talked about real apocalypse. So contemporary movies like maybe The Boy in the Striped Pajamas or Sophie's Choice, can they be also catalogued within that same bracket of what she refers to as real apocalypse?
I haven't caught the part of the question because of the connection. Sorry.
Should I repeat?
Can you write?
Repeat?
Should I repeat the question?
Yes, I understood that you said that I don't know what can be considered the real apocalypse, but I'm not sure what.
Okay, but the point is that, are there definitive prerequisites, at least in the way you use the term?
I can't hear. Can you write in the chat box?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, in the meanwhile, Anuradha,
Yes.
can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you, but I have received actually, two questions.
I've seen.
Yes.
Just before that, I just want to ask Arlene one little thing.
Sure.
It's thoroughly intriguing, Arlene. It was a wonderful presentation. I'm asking for a little bit of clarification that Blanchot, in the writing of the disaster, is related to forgetfulness without memory. I am actually asking you to explain a little more on this interface of memory and apocalypse as such.
Well, if you remember, it is mainly the term of the immemorial that I refer to. And this term of the immemorial is something Blanchot worked on, as well as the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas and Jean-François Lyotard himself. So this is, when we speak about a disaster that leaves nobody behind to witness to it, this kind of disaster goes into oblivion, and yet we have the duty to remember it. That is the paradox that I was talking about. And of course, it is much more complicated than that. But
okay, I have collected one or two more questions. Can we go ahead with that? I think we have time for that. Just a couple of more questions.
Yeah.
Okay, Arlene, so there is one question from Urunima Sen here, and she's asking, Beckett's, just a minute. Yes, Beckett's representation of the void is not in absences, but in excesses. In terms of language, action and repetition of both. A decade after the Holocaust, why is trauma being expressed in excess, do you think?
In Beckett's creation.
I think so. That's what she's asking.
Well, this is a problem that I also took into account when writing quite a few essays on Beckett and analyzing his own life. Beckett was at the time of the Second World War in France, and he was somebody who participated in the French Resistance. His best friend, Alfred Perron, was killed in a concentration camp. And there are quite a few voices nowadays who say that it is really easy to always say that, for instance, Waiting for Godot is just a play about somebody named Godot who may be God, like Pierrot, Charlot, Margot, and that the two tramps just experience some sort of negative experiences while waiting for a response, for a hope from God. But as Adorno also mentioned, and as a few scholars mentioned in more recent studies, including myself, there are so many veiled metaphors of the Holocaust in Beckett's texts that you can see that, in fact, these are images of the real apocalypses. I can give you one example. For instance, there are a few articles that I wrote which are published in Partial Answers, the last one, in 2019, and one in 2013, in which, for instance, Estragon tells Vladimir, you'd better kill me like the others. And Vladimir asks, which others? And he says, like billions of others. And such sentences are clearly referring to a mass apocalypse. And then people started to realize that indeed everything is a veiled metaphor of a post-Holocaust world war, Second World War in Beckett's texts, including in some of the prose, late prose.
Okay. Yes. Thank you for your answer, Arlene. And there is one more question coming from an ID, but he or she hasn't introduced herself or himself to us. But the question goes this way, and I'm just reading out. It says, deep nothingness is the basic premise of existentialism. Hence, can we call it the philosophy of the apocalypse?
I'm sorry, what is it? I couldn't hear.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'm just reiterating the question. It says, deep nothingness is the basic
nothingness.
Yes, deep nothingness is the basic premise of existentialism. Hence, can we call it the philosophy of the apocalypse?
Well, we can call it, we can certainly call it like that. Yes, I agree.
Okay. So, for the time being, I don't see any more questions coming, and therefore I think...
Madam, one question is there from Dr. Manos Ranjan Panda from the audience.
Okay.
He asks a question to Arlene. Can you please give some poems written on the images of the apocalypse?
Well, I myself am not a specialist in poetry. I'm a specialist in fiction and drama. But I can tell you that there is a whole Routledge Encyclopedia of Modernism, which has a section on apocalypse poets. And that starts, if I remember correctly, from Surrealism, and lots of poets in the 20th century are listed there.
Okay,
Oh,
thank you very much, Arlene, for your nice presentation and please
Thank you.
yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Salam, for repeating the question. I mean, to Ali. Since there is no other question that is visible in the live chat comment box on YouTube, I think it's time we moved on to our next speaker for the day without
Okay.
wasting any more time. Aline, thank you so very much, not just for such an enlightening presentation, but also for answering patiently all the questions that were asked to you. Please stay on with us for the next speaker for the day.
Okay.
So, okay, okay.
I
Thank
will
you.
mute myself. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Okay,
Thank you
sure.
very much.
Yeah, pleasure, Aline. Okay, so the next speaker we have is Dr. Pinaki De, Associate Professor of English, Raja Pyari Mohan College, Uttarpara, West Bengal, India. And his paper is titled Apocalypse Narratives in Comics. I would, just briefly say that Pinaki happens to be my classmate and friend, and therefore, it's extremely a moment of great joy to have him here with us today as one of our speakers. So let me also again briefly read a bio note of his to introduce him properly and formally to you. Uh, Dr. Pinaki De is a multiple award-winning graphic illustrator designer who regularly works for renowned publishers like Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Hachette, Routledge, Primus, Oxford University Press, Singapore University Press, Bloomsbury, Orient Black Swan, Worldview, Pan Picador, Permanent Black, Alchemy, Sedge, Rowley, Sahitya Academy, Rupa, and many others. He has designed almost 500 book covers till date. He is the winner of the Publishing Next Prize for the best book cover design in India twice in 2017 and 2019. His book cover for Calcutta, the novel by Kunal Basu, won the prestigious Oxford Bookstore Prize for the best cover design in India at Jaipur Literary Fest 2017. His layout design on Satyajit Ray's archival manuscripts has drawn accolades from all across the globe. A Charles Wallace Trust Fellow, his PhD is on comics theory. Pinaki is one of the editors of the prestigious annual magazine Longform, published from HarperCollins 2018, which is generally regarded as the first global comics magazine from India. He is the Indian Comics Advisor of Mangasia, the biggest ever exhibition on Asian comics curated by Paul Gravett for the Barbican, London. His book-length comics on Partition is due next year. Pinaki juggles his creative work with academics as he has a day job as an associate professor of Raja Pyari Mohan College, as I already mentioned. So, Pinaki, I extend a very, very warm welcome to you. Not to mention that we are all waiting for your book-length comics, and for the present. So this virtual dais is now all yours. So could you kindly now begin your presentation? Thank you.
Yeah. Can you hear me? I mean, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Am I audible? Okay, wonderful.
Audible,
So,
visible. Yes.
yeah. So, first of all, I must tell you, it's wonderful to do a webinar. Not wonderful and not so wonderful to do a webinar, because I always feel, one-to-one interaction is the best. But really grateful to both you, Anuradha, and also Anshuman. You are almost my favorite people in academics, and it's such a wonderful occasion, just to be with you people, and at least talk about certain things we love to talk about, right? So of course Erlin did a very comprehensive presentation, and frankly I don't have a prepared presentation at all, because what I want to talk about is my idea, the way I look at apocalypse as an artist, as an academic, and also as a reader, right? And if you look at the at the idea of apocalypse, it's such a big idea. It's such a huge thing to tackle in a seminar where I'll be talking probably about 40-45 minutes, I think it doesn't make sense. So what I have done is I want to specifically talk about certain aspects of the apocalyptic narratives that we see in comics, and maybe take some texts, introduce you to some text which most of you may or may not know. I am not sure. Most of you may not know them because they are not so popular texts in that sense. And I'll try to do what? I'll try to talk about the landscape, the very idea of landscape that is being depicted in a post-apocalyptic scenario, in comics, and how that landscape becomes a kind of a metaphor for the very idea of, creation, the very idea, that the landscape in a way contains the kernel of the creator's mind as he scratches his or her pen on the whiteness of the paper. So we begin with a white paper, and somehow I think the way the landscape unlocks in the apocalypse narrative, we actually get back to the whiteness of the paper. So it's a bit of a metaphysical kind of a route that I'll be taking. And what I'll try to do, of course, is talk about some comics which are, first of all, let me tell you, I don't like the term graphic novel precisely. I have my own reasons, but if you like the term graphic novel, good for you. So read comics as graphic novels and graphic novels as comics. For me, I have no problems there, but I'll use the word comics regularly. So if there are any questions about why I'm using the comics, it can be another seminar, and that would be a nice thing to discuss later on. But right now, let's stick to the word comics, as I was, as I am, sort of more comfortable with the word. Okay, now when we talk about the landscape in graphic narratives, in comics, the kind of apocalyptic narratives that are there in comics. Comics seems to be a kind of a telomere medium where you actually can depict a lot of graphic narratives in a very, very interesting way. I'm more interested in the way the landscape is presented in those comics. Okay, so for example, you can have a barren, blasted, lifeless landscape as a result of a nuclear holocaust, or you can have a kind of an inundated, desiccated, ice-covered landscape, which may be due to climate change. You can have a post-capitalist, post-abundant landscape, the kind of plentiful land, the landscape of the plentiful due to various disasters that may occur. You can have actually a garbage-filled landscape due to, effects of consumerism, machines, war. It can be anything, right? Or you can have an altered, mutant, poisonous landscape, maybe due to alien invasion, nuclear holocaust, other cataclysmic events. So, that may be specified, that may not be specified in the comics narrative. Or you can have a kind of a renaturalized post-human kind of a landscape in plagues, which is a result of plagues and natural disaster. So if you look at the comics, you can get this pretty frequently. So, for example, one of the most famous comics which depicts the post-apocalyptic landscape, later made into a TV series, is The Walking Dead. But I'll not talk about The Walking Dead because everybody talks about The Walking Dead. And then, of course, you can also have this amazing manga like, Akira, for example, which again was made for TV later on, which can be, emblematic of the kind of landscape I'm talking about. So you have a lot of popular works being made. So I'm a Legend, for example, again, a kind of a comics that was made as a film later on. They all sort of, try to project a certain kind of landscape, okay? A certain kind of desolation, a certain kind of excess. So either it is a certain kind of desolation or or it is a kind of an excess that they want to produce. So that the kind of bleakness of landscape that you see in the comics, conform to the idea of plenitude or the idea of lack. Either you don't have anything, it's like a bare minimum landscape, a wasteland of sorts, or you have too much of everything, and you cannot even wade through the landscape because it's full of detritus that we have left behind. So that's the kind of thing that you can always have in comics. Now, let me, I don't know, I mean, I will share screen first of all. So first of all, let me talk about a comics that I really like. First of all, let me share the screen. Let me share the screen, and please tell me whether the screen is visible to you. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen, all of you? Anuradha, Angshuman, can anybody see the screen? Is it visible? Hello? Hello?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, wonderful. I wanted that confirmation. So, okay. So the book that I'll discuss first, yes, I'm sorry. So the book that I'll discuss first is this book called Letter to Survivors. It's an old book. It's a French book just translated, to English. And I feel that it's a book that we need to talk about a lot, okay? Frankly, it is written by JB, and if you actually know JB, JB is Jorge Blondieu, who was basically one of the great illustrators, later editor of the legendary French magazine Charlie Hebdo. Okay, so of course Charlie Hebdo came to limelight for completely different reasons, but they, the people who used to run them were real great illustrators also, and they had their own work in, and what is very interesting about Letter to Survivor is a kind of a post-apocalyptic story. So if you look at the screen here, you can see that there is a hazmat suited mailman who is cycling through a supposedly post-nuclear Holocaust landscape, okay, wasteland, and is delivering letters. Now he can only deliver letter through a kind of a periscope type opening. So of course you may ask, who is he delivering the letter to? So of course the mailman comes. The mailman is out in the open, and you can see there is nothing in the landscape except some small things here and there. And the mailman actually get the letter to a family which is there inside the bunker. Okay, so the family is within the bunker, and the mailman actually delivers the letter. So now these letters are not in a way business as usual correspondences, okay, but rather they are stories. So the letters contain stories which are basically the surreal and cryptic retelling of the past. So what I want you to concentrate here is, of course, the concept of space, and also the concept of time. And of course, as we all know, the comics narrative in a way visually always try to play around. Of course, every narrative do, but comics narrative visually also try to juggle between the very kind of space between the kind of interaction you have between space and time. So what is happening is that later are basically surreal, cryptic retelling of the past. Not only of the past, it is also retelling of France as a country, because that is where it is set, and also of the family, who is of course in the bunker, as well as the individuals. And through these tales, of course, which start off as being something very poignant, but benign, and then grows and gradually the tales become more and more sinister. And you can see the family is actually getting what I called acquainted with stories which otherwise they would have forgotten. So the letters are like what I call memory souvenirs, which are delivered by a postman, hazmat clad postman, in the present, but the letters themselves are like memory tokens of the past. Now, where do the family live in? Do the family live in the present or the past? As you can easily understand, JB somehow juxtaposes the open space outside with the claustrophobic bunker inside, and you really don't know the kind of time in which the family is really living. So the family is living presently after the Holocaust within the bunker, but in a way, through the letters, through those memory tokens, they are also taken to the pastness of their life. And that is something very, very interesting. So, see, they are first of all confined in as a family to their cramped quarters, and they were, as you can easily understand, initially excited for the kind of distraction that the letters bring, because they somehow make them remember of the golden age, before the World War III and a nuclear winter, which actually is the tragedy which made them disappear into the bunker. But later on, they also began to get provoked. They began to get agitated in the way, the letters talk about their presentness. Now, what I'm trying to say is that this is, of course, the book. Let me show you the book. This is the cover, and this is the first page of the book. You can see page 2, page 3 in the below. I'm not sure whether I can show you the mark. If I can mark it, I think it is best. I think I can mark it. Yes, I can mark it. So this is the way, of course, the story moves. And you can easily understand that as it moves from the openness of the space, to a more kind of a close quarter. So let me show you first. This is the beginning. Mailman, you have got a letter for you. And then from the hole, they are actually getting the letter. And after that, you can see, they are transported to a completely different world, beyond the bunker. So, the work moves in between the present and the past, but it also talks about a kind of a dichotomy, the of the open space and the closed space below. The open space is, of course, not claustrophobic, but it is claustrophobic in the way it is bereft of any kind of vegetation, any kind of trees, any kind of natural habitat that you should normally get. And the bunker inside, in a way, is an artificial construct, of course, constructed by the humans, and in which the humans are trapped. Okay, so of course the humans, in a way, also denuded the outside, denuded the wasteland, and in a way slithered back with the worm-like within the inside, and is thinking then of what may have happened earlier in time. So you can see, this is the, I think this shows the concept of the book itself. So up you can actually see the landscape, and here you can actually see the opening of the letter. This is the nuclear bunker, and here you can actually breathe, barely breathe. So here you are all alone again, just the four of you. We have a couple and 2 children. Of course, that dog is not there. You can see the dog later. You can see the dog actually in the landscape outside, outside the bunker. So, this is something which is very, very interesting. In one panel, I cannot show you the entire book, but in one panel, you can see that the landscape outside, there is a dream of that. You can see the opening of the periscope and the kind of machinations which you see. But here you can see the landscape which is intact. But, in the next panel, that it is only a hallucination of the omniscient narrator, because all this disappeared in one go. So what was there earlier disappeared in one go. So just a kind of a panel stroke enabled, a picture perfect photograph like landscape getting completely denuded, almost getting, almost getting evaporated at an instant. Even the dog gets evaporated. So, what I want to talk, so this is, of course, very, very interesting. It's also interesting to note that the letter cannot be read by the family inside. It is read by the mailman or the postman, and he is dictating the letter. And you can see this panel where there is a very interesting sort of dialogue. No more radio, no more TV. And by now you have read each of the 12 books in the shelter twice. That is why I thought to rattle off these snatches of stories as they came to me. Pick out a choice spot to picture yourself listening to them: a garret, a hammock, a thatched hut, or a seat by the fireside. Of course, all these never exists, but it is as if, that hazmat-clad mailman is trying to rejog, the very setting of the storytelling session that you otherwise would have had if this was a normal world. But of course, this is not a normal world. This is not the world that you are living in. And you can easily understand this is a world where, spaces somehow collapses, opens up, sometimes as memories, sometimes as illusions, sometimes hidden from within the bunker, sometimes from the word that are there in the letter, sometimes it is also there in the way the mailman talks about them, the way he narrates this story through. And it's very, very interesting is, the idea of the mailman as the narrator, and a narrator in a post-apocalyptic scenario. I always have this feeling that JB is almost trying to mock the way he is writing, the very act of writing this work. The very act of writing this work is to look at the work from beyond time and space and to read it in a very post-apocalyptic scenario where all the anchors of the narrative have disappeared, and where everything that you see somehow gets, coalesces into a kind of letters, the words for you. So what comes out to you are only words or letters that are there, that form the text of the letter. So the text of the letter are the stories that you tell, and those stories are the stories that you can live with, because outside that there is nothing which can prevent you from being, from being out of your comfort zone. I don't know whether I'm making sense, but this work, I always feel this work to be a very good introduction to the kind of, theoretization I want to do about, let me stop sharing for a second and get back to, what I can say to my real self, because sometimes I feel, doing a lot of screen share doesn't allow to have a eye contact, so that's something I feel more reassuring. So, I began with Gebe intentionally because here space is demarcated. Okay, you can have a open space and you have a bunker, but they are demarcated space. They are space which are different from each other. They are physically demarcated. They are, of course, they may be demarcated by time or not by time. That's not a matter of much importance, but they're physically demarcated. So you have a kind of an open space which is very claustrophobic, and a claustrophobic space which is in a way always closed, enclosed, and totally claustrophobic. So you cannot escape from the very idea of enclosedness, because even the open space gives you a sense of a kind of a denuded infinity, which in itself is a kind of closed circuit system within which you as a reader is also trapped. Okay, so let me again go to another comics. Again, this comic is not as such an apocalyptic narrative, but I want to show you this comic because here the spaces are demarcated, but the time is actually getting more and more complicated. Now, what I am trying to say when I'm talking about space and time in apocalyptic narrative, what I want to push actually forward is the very idea that, the apocalypse is now, the nowness of apocalypse, the immediacy of apocalypse. So whether you read any other books, Beckett, I don't care what you read, whatever you read, even if it is a futuristic dystopia, the very idea of apocalypse is also the kind of nowness which is always a kind of nowness that we always carry within us. Apocalypse is that immediacy that we carry within us. We are all deeply fearful of the way it can crowd our brains. It can actually enclose our entire system and make us more automaton like. Let me again share the screen. I hope you can share see the screen again. And now I hope you can see the screen. Can you see the screen? Can you see the screen again? I mean, just want a confirmation. Anybody? Okay. Now I'm going to show you an amazing work called Here by Richard Maguire. I don't know what kind of work, what kind of genre it fits in. I think it's one of the most revolutionary work as far as any kind of narrative is concerned, here is actually about a same space. It is about the sameness of space. So here begins with, the book begins with a kind of a corner of the room. You can see the fireside and you can see the window. Again, the very idea of private and the public, the enclosed space and what is outside is being played out. So through the window, you can see the outside, which is of course blank whiteness, and within you can see a kind of grayness which it encloses. Again, it's about closed and closed and open spaces, about being inside and being outside. It is also about being here and there, something which you are now and which you can be there either in the past or in the future. So, this narrative, this is actually a novel or a comics or a graphic narrative, whatever you tell it, where space doesn't move, but what moves is a story. So you can see the setting never changes, the corner of the room never changes, but what you do, and I'll just try to do it in a very quick, I'll just do the pages in a very quick format. You can see a year being referred to. Can you see the year? I can show you the year. Can you see the year? 1957 written in the far corner. So what is happening? There are timelines that are given, and you can understand that timeline conform to the kind of setting that the space had during that moment or during that part of the year. So if you just go very quickly, you can see the space never changes, but what changes is a kind of timeline which is imposed in order to create a sense of simultaneity. So you actually begin with this is the end paper, and as I've told you, let me again go backward. You can see this is of course a kind of a stop motion which I have prepared so that you can easily understand. Of course, if you read the book, this kind of effect is not possible, but the stop motion is there in order to show you how you can actually manipulate time, keeping the space constant. So let me go a bit slow here, because I don't think you actually got the the meticulousness of the story. So this is not about apocalypse, but this is about time. And as you all know, apocalypse is also about time. It is also what was there before, and it is also what it can be before. The whole story, the timeline, is actually from 500 million BC to 2033. So if you read the book carefully, the timeline of the book is from 500 million BC. So there was no humans there. And then to 2033, of course, where there are humans, but also the way the space changes and the way the metamorphosis of the space takes place. So if you look at the first panel, for example, you can see the word 1957 written. There are no humans. It's a kind of a pink toned photograph, 60s kind of design, 50s, 60s kind of American household. If you know correctly, this is actually Maguire's own place at New Jersey. That is what Maguire tells in a kind of a note, but it can be anywhere. It can be your room as well. And as you can see, 1942, it was a different wallpaper, different cartoon, different kind of a mirror. So the space remains the same, but of course the house may have changed ownership. Of course, the people, of course, have died. People are born, and things have changed. But why I'm calling it a kind of a why there is this, why I'm including this as a kind of a kind of an apocalyptic narrative, is the way it talks about the frightening prospect of the past and the future, intruding our nowness. Because this is not nowness, this is close to nowness. 2017, let's assume the year is 2019, then of course this room will be what it is now. But whenever that nowness has that kind of stability, has that kind of beautiful has that kind of beauty about it, has that kind of a kind of peace about it, has that kind of kind of a seduction about it, which we cannot ignore, right? The seduction of domesticity in a way. But what I want to talk about is, if this space is opened up to time, and of course it's not about future only, if it is opened up to the past time, not past time, past time, and also to the future time, then the possibilities are fearful. And let me show you again. You can see this is 1623. The house was not built, and this was a swamp. So you can see In the earlier year, 1957, there was this lady who was in the house, and it is actually put in the inset. And in 1623, the other spaces of the house was actually a marshland. So the house was probably built on a marshland. And then suddenly, the disappearance of the house altogether, with the lady only in the inset as a token of remembrance of the things that are now. Nowness, of course, implies 1957. And the pastness of 1623 induces a kind of fear within us, a fear of being left in a scenario where no humans inhabit. So the very idea of post-human apocalyptic scenario can also be evoked in the pastness of time. So it is not only that you have to travel in the future in order to talk about apocalypse. The very idea of apocalypse is in the way the humans are effaced from the pages of the narrative. So when the humans slowly gets effaced, that's a deep lying fear within us, that when, of course, it's also there in Godot, for example, and I can explain it if I'm giving time later maybe. But the very idea of denuding the page, of making the page bare, of making the page getting, the human anchors out of the narrative, that induces a sense of apocalypse within us. Again, it goes back to 55 and 1989. You can see it is peopled again with humans. If you go by 8000 BC, for example, the marsh has a different kind of character, and you can see the kind of desolation it sort of exudes. And the humans which are there in the inset talking in 1989 probably couldn't have imagined that in 8000 BC, the space that is beside them, the place where the fire, was kept, could have been this kind of sinister calmness, sense of sinister calmness about it. Again, 1009 BC, you can see the landscape as something different. 1573, again, the landscape changes. 1637, again, the landscape has a different feel to it. And 1763, you can see a kind of a structure coming up, trees being cut, and the space being cleared up to build a kind of a space for domestic interaction between humans. So and again, say 1766, that thing is actually built. The house was destroyed in 1783. So there was a fire that destroys the edifice, which in a way is also the metaphor of the structures collapsing into a kind of, nothingness, which is subsumed within a landscape of, no value within quote to the humans, of course. So again, it sort of intercuts it between the idea of domesticity and openness. But what is openness and domesticity in context of the narrative which is set in the same space? So what you have actually is a space beyond the window, which speaks of nothingness, but outside is actually within. What is within today was outside, what is outside today was within, earlier. And it may be that maybe in the future, when the humans are no more, when the house will no more remain, it can get back to the kind of pastness, the kind of desolation of pastness which this space can actually exude. So what I'm trying to say is that here you can see space is demarcated, but it is not demarcated strictly in terms of physicality of the page itself. The very page, contains the hairness of the space, and also the there-ness of the space. So the very idea of here and there, collapses within a kind of a simultaneity of time within which the story moves. So, what I find very fascinating is actually, this is not apocalypse narrative, but I do read it as a kind of a forewarning of the kind of thing that can happen when space opens up in time, both in terms of the past and as well as the future. So, so what I want to talk about really is so let me again go through the text in a very interesting way. Let me go to the text, kind of a flip kind of, you must have done this flip book kind of thing, playing cricket, the kind of an animation flip book. So let me do it like an animation flip book, and you can see how the the absence of anything within an enclosed space returns back to that very space itself, and in between you actually talk about the outside, the inside, which collapses to create a continuum of timelessness. So the very idea of spacelessness, timelessness, despite being, the time and space is demarcated, but sometimes in apocalypse narrative, it collapses in such a seamless way that, the very idea of what I call your Cartesian identity is threatened, because we are people, who are nestled within time and space. So if any narrative which induces a kind of timelessness and a spacelessness, for me becomes an apocalyptic narrative, because we are very threatened by the erasure of time and space in the narrative. Of course, you cannot erase time and space in real world, but you can induce an illusion of something that is getting erased. And the very idea of the time and space collapsing into each other, talking about simultaneously echoing each other, colliding with each other, collapsing, almost overlapping with each other, becoming a continuum, is actually something that really makes us fearful. Again, let us go with the flip book kind. So this is, or maybe let me go a bit slowly, because I think it will give you a better sense. So this is the book in slow motion, if you permit me to tell that. So this is the book in slow motion. I think this is a better pace, and I think you can understand how innovative this book is in terms of its content, and in the terms it talks about the inevitability of pastness and presentness, which actually almost disappears into a future of nothingness. Okay, so this is my second example. Here again, you cannot demarcate time and space that much. Let me get back to my own self. I hope I don't know. I hope you get a sense of what I'm trying to take, because frankly, I must tell you, I'm not interested in just making a kind of a list of apocalyptic narratives, because you can just go to the internet and get those. Let me get back to the next kind of comics that I want to talk about, and this is again very, very unique. This is not a comics as such. Many people call it a picture book, and the one that I will show you is is a work called Cages. Okay, and the cage. Let me again share the screen. Let me again share the screen. I'm sorry, I'm just sometimes sharing in and out, coming in and out, because I love eye contact, because it seems that I can actually talk with you, at least virtually, at least start a kind of a conversation with you. But anyway, let me also talk about this book, and which is called Cage. And the book Cage is by Martin Vaughan. This is a very old book. It's a kind of a book that in a way ushers in the very idea of artiness of the comics or the graphic novel, whatever you want to talk about. And I always talk about this book because it is actually about the way graphic panels are constructed. As we all know, graphic panels are constructed within mostly rectangular spaces. And I personally feel this is Martin Vaughan James, the cage. And I think the cage is a metaphor of the panel within which the pictures and the words, the texts and the visuals are nestled. So they are in a way a kind of extended metaphor of the very idea of comics itself, because the panels are like cages. Now what I want to do is, of course, to break away from the cage. How do you break the panel? How do you find the scar and the wound within the panel to break free of the panel and talk about the space outside the cage? So what I'm trying to talk about, the cage actually is about it's a narrative which has got some words, but there are no humans. Again, we don't know whether it's an apocalyptic scenario, a post-apocalyptic scenario. It probably is, but nowhere there is a mention of an apocalypse. So what you get is, of course, a kind of a bare landscape and a cage which contains a piece of that landscape. Of course, you can, beyond the cage, you can see the infinite space of that bareness of landscape. But within the our cage is also there to at least geometrically bind some of the space inside that bareness. Now if you look at the cage, And let me show you the work, because this is the book. So the cage begins with barbed wire, and from the barbed wire you can see the landscape. Again, if you look at the metaphor of looking inside and outside, the whether you are in the time or out of the time, and the way you are looking at a narrative is being talked about here. The cage is without any humans. What it talks about are only the things that we have left behind. The humans have left behind the detritus of their living, the detritus of their consumer world, the cameras, the pictures, of course, things from nature. Whatever is left behind is being talked about. So in a way, it's a book about objects, but without any human touch. Of course, a human touch means there are no humans touching those objects. So they were touched earlier. That is the hint, though they were used by the humans earlier. But what you are looking at is a pure, desolate landscape. If you look at the banality of what I call the domestic scenes, which are predicated, you can easily understand the banality of the scene which are there. They are predicated on a voracious carbon economy and its violent, probable, violent geological consequences. They are actually embedded within with a kind of a forewarning of an environmental disaster. What I really like about cages is the way it works. The way the image. Let me show you this, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Look at this panel, and they are all single panels. Mostly they are single panels within the page. There are no, they are almost unitary panels as it is. And you can see that they have almost words which are there above, which goes above the text, and it doesn't intrude into the picture. So there are no words over the picture. There are no speech balloons. And of course, there cannot be any speech balloons because there are no humans. Not even the omniscient narrator. He can only see, he cannot speak about the landscape that he actually sees as a dream, an illusion, or as a reality. We really don't know. So the cage stands as before, unfinished and already decayed, as of its construction has been abruptly and inexplicably arrested. So again, we don't know. This is a very surreal landscape. You can see cloudlets, and you can see small papers attached to pole, and you can see the landscape, which is a bit serrated, which we really cannot make sense of because we don't know what exactly this landscape represents. But as you go, you can easily understand they become plants. So the hyacinth-like plants, so the entire landscape becomes much more habitable or much more recognizable to humans, because earlier they were just oval-shaped, egg-shaped stuff, and then it becomes magically transforms into hyacinth-like undergrowth, which contains those blank pieces of paper over which you need to probably write your own dream. And again, you can see the way, you can see a pyramid at the background, kind of a Mayan kind of a pyramid which exists almost like a dream. And you can see those in the way the perspective is played on. So if you can see this, for example, and if you can see that this page, you can see the change of perspective easily. Now you can actually see that there was an eruption so sudden and violent that it was reduced to a rubble. We don't know what kind of eruption happened, but you can easily understand the eruption also happened on the paper. So the paper was blank. Can you see the paper was blank earlier, but the eruption happened and all this was reduced to nothingness. So is the author trying to imply that the eruption happened in the mind of the author, the inkiness of eruption? Is the author destroying the landscape by the very inkiness, by the ink with which he is actually drawing the landscape? So you can understand the metafictional underpinning, or what I call the meta-creative underpinning of the very narrative. And this is also something which I find uncannily interesting in apocalyptic narratives. There is always that idea of destruction being played out in the mind that somehow finds a kind of a real visual depiction within the narrative of the apocalyptic films or books or comics or whatever it can be, animation films, whatever the medium can be, anything. So the very inkiness, the way the ink is splattered on the blank pages, actually creates the eruption. So the eruption may be the eruption within the mind of the artist who is actually seeing. Once the eruption happens within the mind, you can see that the landscape is more desolate than ever. Again, there is a change of perspective, and you can see that there is an elaborate structure of which the cage is only one of the feature. But again, you can see the cameras. You can see the cameras through which, the telephones. But these cameras or telephones are also juxtaposed with ink that has splattered. Now, the ink that was within the page is now floating around the cameras. And they are objects, of course, but in the way they are drawn, they are very malleable, and you can think that they may not be real objects. They may be the objects of your dream. So, of course, as you can understand, camera, telephone, and the movie camera, or they may be all metaphors of eyes, ears, of vision and sound, and they actually create this hyper real world of something that exists yet doesn't do. So so the very idea of effacing something, the idea of creation involves a kind of effacement of something that was there. And until you efface that what was there and then create something out of that destructive destruction, out of the detritus of destruction, you cannot create the work. So in a way, the very idea of the cage is maybe the cage of the mind of the creator who is creating this masterpiece. Now, if you go again in the narrative, and as you move in the narrative, you can see that the world becomes much more surreal, much more disjointed. Things began to fly apart, almost defying gravity. And as it flies apart, it also concentrates on the splotches of ink that almost mark every page at almost regular intervals. So you can have, they are almost like the, have you seen the Rorschach, Rorschach's kind of mark that is normally used? So that kind of mark almost splatters all through the pages. And then suddenly from the outside, this is of course the outside, you actually enter inside of a domestic room, and within the room you can see sand seeping in. So again, a very surreal kind of, it's straight out of a Dali masterpiece. And you can see that this is a domestic space, but this is also a space where the outside is creeping in. So this is inside, but the outside is also creeping in. And there will be a time when the inside will be, completely filled up with the outside. So again, you see the same kind of thematic concern of the way the inside and the outside collapses. The very idea of space and time collapses in order to create a sense of vertigo within us, in order to almost assault the very, Cartesian idea of stability with which we, we anchor our identity in everyday reality. So we try to, anchor our very self in the very idea of time and space. We are a creature made out of time and space. We cannot ignore that. And the very basis of stability on this earth is the way we actually make sense of time and space. But when you actually create this kind of convoluted idea of time and space, even an illusion of it, suddenly the world of apocalypse opens up. Everything collapses, and everything seems to tumble out of nothing. Of course, you can always remember the very interesting film Inception, where everything is not what it seems, and time and space somehow coalesce together in order to create a kind of formlessness, a kind of timelessness, and a kind of spacelessness, and where you are yanked out of your comfort zone. Your comfort zone is your zone in time and space, and once you are yanked out of your comfort zone, you are reduced to a kind of a ruble who is floating in and out of time, and you cannot make sense of it the way you should have made sense if you had a kind of an anchor in the very reality of any kind of situation. So what is very interesting in cages is again the very idea of time and space, the very idea of inside and outside, is the very idea of now and then, is also the idea of the past and present all collapsing together within a kind of a kaleidoscope, which in a way echoes each other to create a mishmash of what I called repetitive dreams. And when you see those repetitive dreams being played out, on a plane beyond time and space, or at least on a plane purportedly beyond time and space, you have a sense of a moving apocalypse. You think the ground under your feet is moving. Everything seems different from what it could have been. Everything seems a bit illusory. Everything loses its dimension. What is actually easily understandable suddenly collapses into a kind of formlessness. This is what I call the intimation of an apocalypse. My idea of apocalypse is the way objects collapses if it is yanked out of time and space, or at least an illusion of time and space is being confounded to create a sense of a collapse that actually creates a kind of a vertigo in the mind, a vertigo of timelessness, a vertigo of spacelessness. Okay, so you can easily see this is the book, and I actually advise you, all of you, to go through the book, because I find this book to be fascinating, because it's also a book about objects and what men could have left after they have lived their life on the earth. There are no men or women here, no humans, so it's kind of a classic post-human scenario where all the objects in a way actually reiterate the lives that men could have lived, men or women could have lived, the humans could have lived, but are now not living. Okay, so this is again, it ends with the splash of the ink, which gives you a sense of a kind of a metaphorical dimension. Let me stop sharing again. I don't know what I'm talking about, because I'm just talking a kind of a stream of consciousness kind of thing. But let me also go to other kind of works, because these are works which are very close to my heart, and these are the works I grew up as an artist. And these are the works that gives me a sense of who am I beyond my idea of what time and space is, because I cannot avoid time and be beyond time and space. We are within time and space. But these works makes me think about those, and then I can dream about the apocalypse. I always dream the apocalypse being something very imaginative. It can be real, it can happen in real, I don't care. I may not see an apocalypse. Of course, we may be seeing an apocalypse like situation now, and it already seems a bit unreal. Okay, so the very idea of again, the very idea of the COVID-19 pandemic has actually we are talking about lockdown, being confined within our own space, and you can easily understand those ideas of time and space are already playing out in our mind. The very idea of being confined within a time, within a space where time rarely moves, gives you a sense of an apocalypse, a kind of an intimation of an apocalypse coming, almost rushing towards you, almost gobbling up with kind of a monstrous like ferocity. Anyway, so let me again share another screen and go to another work which I personally find to be amazing. Again, let me show whether you can see this. This is a work which again I have shown you Letters to a Survivor. I've shown you here. I've shown you Cages. Let me show you Anders Lindsen, Dogs and Water. And I really, really like this work. It's an amazing work. I must tell you, one of the best works I have seen. Nielsen is, of course, very philosophical. And this, again, is about a very denuded landscape, a landscape where nothing really happens. So Dog and Water, in a way, chronicles a piece of a lonely journey without origin or destruction. So we don't know whether this is a landscape which actually has the origin story in mind, that is before the humans arrived, or this is landscape which is actually a post-human apocalyptic scenario where there is only one survivor. Of course, a young man is, of course, wandering. You can see a young man is wandering, carrying a teddy bear as a companion, which inertly, in a way, endures his desperation, anger, and musings on the way. You can easily understand that this is a road that will never end. In the very first page, you can see that there is a sense of a vanishing point, and that vanishing point varies at various parts. First of all, there are no hard panels. There are no square panels, because if you actually contain these images within panel, you destroy the kind of infinite, the kind of intimation of infinity that this work is trying to talk about. What I'm trying to talk about, that this is a road to nowhere, and this man is traveling, and of course he will encounter something in between, but he will continue to travel. So it's a road to nowhere, and it's a road from nowhere. So we don't know, so we don't have an end point. Again, the very idea of telos, at the beginning, the origin and the telos is almost being effaced, and you are almost floating in a kind of nowhere. You are floating in between, the in-betweenness. So there is no point A and point B. That is what I'm trying to talk about. Whenever there is a specific point A and a specific point B, and you travel from point to A to B in time. So let me, show you this, because I hope you can make out. So oh gosh, I cannot show you this. I'm sorry. Let me show you this in a different space. I'm sorry. I'm taking a bit of time. I'll not bore you more, because I have 2-3 more examples to talk about. There are very interesting Indian examples. I really don't know whether I'll get time to that, because the time is not much. But still, let me show you. Oh gosh. Yeah, so this is it. So can you see a kind of a blank space within me, and I am drawing. So you can always talk about a point A and a point B. So you can travel from point A to point B, and from here. But the very idea of traveling from point A to B also talks about an anchor. So you are dropping an anchor at point A, and you are dropping an anchor in point B. So you are basically literally mapping A in both time and space. So you are traveling from a known time and space to, again, a known time and space. But if you actually efface these points, if you erase these points, and you are only talking of this space where time and space may collapse and fall into each other, you have that sense of apocalypse, because the very idea of time and space gets yanked out of your system. That gives you a sense of apocalypse. That is what I'm trying to make sense of. So let me get back to dogs and water, and you can see this man is traveling in a space. He's talking to himself. He's talking to the to the dog, and you can see the landscape is cold, probably because he's wearing a jumper, and of course bleak with few landmarks, and offers only precarious encounters with animals and armed men. So there are some encounters, but the encounters are with either armed men. You can see the armed men. A bus travels with a man pointing a gun towards him, or there are animals which are very dangerous. So there are animals which also sometimes sort of he encounters. Later, of course, these interactions are in a way rife with what I call instinct, the drive of survival, the human ethics concerning the killed and the injured, the very idea, human ethic of violence, that concern the idea of being killed and injured, finds a sense here. But he actually, at the end of the journey, he finds acceptance. This man finds acceptance, and this is the end of the story. This man finds acceptance in a pack of dogs. So it is only when he meets these packs of dogs, their nature is they are wild dogs, and their potential threat is unsettling, because they are like a sudden presence in a kind of a infinite, a kind of a denuded horizon. But they actually are the ones who makes him aware of his identity, of his sense of being. So it's actually a very philosophical word, where the man discovers himself, as he interacts with the dog, as the dog somehow takes him. Initially, they were not, of course, very happy. They were violent, but slowly the man actually could interact with the dog, and they could understand what they. So in a way, the man and the dog, both of them began to interact with each other. What I'm trying to talk about is, in a way, later, if you go to the novel, the land also become in a dreamlike state. The endless land actually becomes a vast body of water, where the boat where he's, in which he will travel, will actually float in a kind of a subconscious space. And on the land, the road will disappear, because as you go through the work, you can see the road is not anymore. So in the beginning, you can see there is a lot of road. Can I show you again? So in the beginning, you can see the road. you can see the road is there. There is a reference to the road, but as you go through the novel, the road disappears, and and he actually continues his journey. So I can just go on. It's a very short novel. It's a 98-page novel, and you can see that later on the whole journey is said to be a kind of a dream. So I don't know. So do you actually dismiss his dream as something merely as a dream? Or do you think his dream to be something that talks about apocalypse in his subconscious mind? So where is apocalypse? Do you wait for apocalypse to happen? No, of course, apocalypse is already always happening inside your mind. It's a kind of a nuclear fission within your mind, which you cannot ever actually prevent. And that's actually also the mind of a very creative dreamer, or a creative writer, or a creative artist, whoever it may be. So as artists, we carry the intimations of apocalypse. And if you don't carry the intimations of apocalypse, I think you cannot write, you cannot create. You need to be mad in order to yank yourself out of time and space to create, or at least make yourself feel comfortable within that situation. Let me again go to another work, because this is a work I really, really love. This is a work called Soft City, and this is actually an old work, 1975 work, but it has just now been, it's again a comics, or it's called the Lost graphic novel. It's called Soft City. And if you look at the work, you can see this work. And if you look at the work, you can see this work is actually by a person called Push Wagner. Okay, Harriton Push Wagner. He was a Norwegian. Push Wagner was his nom de plume. You can understand the word Push Wagner comes from the trolleys that you see in the supermarket. So, the kind of repetitive trolleys that you see in the supermarket, kind of thing that you always push in order to buy things, in order to get seeped within an utopia of consumerist dreams. That is what his nom de plume is. Of course, his real name is Tarje Brofos, but we know him as Harriton Push Wagner. What is Soft City all about? Now, Soft City is actually about 1,000 family leading the life in their same way. Okay, it began. So if you can see the entire, it's a kind of a place where you can have windows after windows and cars of the car, a kind of sameness through which you live. So earlier I have shown you the spaces which are denuded, which are without anything, and here I am showing you things that are too full of everything. So that is what I'm trying to tell. So there is no formula for apocalypse. This is also an apocalyptic world. This is also a world that we don't ever imagine to be true. At least we shouldn't imagine it to be true, but we do sometimes have this in our dreams. A world full of people, so full of people that the pages cannot hold it. Okay, and you can see from the text itself, here in the text, I cannot describe it detail. You can see a kind of an assembly, like people crowding the supermarkets, the assembly kind of people. They are almost filling up every corners of the supermarket. They are going to buy soft meat. Sometimes you are depending on soft pills in order to talk about. You are also talking of soft work. Everything is soft consume, and you are consuming everything. There are no dialogues. The humans never talk, but what the humans do is sometimes they communicate with what I call advertisement signs. So the only form of communication through which they can communicate are advertisement signs. Otherwise, they don't communicate at all. This is a place of plenitude. This is a place of excess, and it is so full of everything that you cannot make sense of anything at all. Of course, in the center, there is a person called controller, and there is a very interesting place in the panel where actually it is written who controls the controller, and nobody knows. So it's a city which is actually built on the very idea of control, the very idea of a kind of a super control. It is a city driven by machinery. It is a city that is driven by consumerism. It is also a city that is driven by excess, and it is a city where excess becomes a nightmare. Of course, we fear nothingness, but we also fear excess. There was a very beautiful question about Godot, where you are talking about Godot being something which is surfeit with excess, and it is also something where it is, because nothingness is also, excess is also nothingness. If you have a blur of excess, if you have something, if you have too much of excess, it's a blur and you have nothing to fall upon. So you can, what I'm trying to say, I'm not talking about soft city in detail, but maybe later, maybe one day I will get chance to talk about soft city. But this also shows the kind of work now there are this is what I wanted to talk about in terms of space and time. But there is also another concern which we find to be kind of very abiding in the comics world now. What is happening in India? Unfortunately, whenever we talk about the apocalypse in India, it somehow becomes somehow veers toward a kind of environmental kind of warning, because of course this is very pertinent in India. There are three works which I can remember. Of course, Appu Pen's amazing work. I don't know whether you know this, The Snake and the Lotus by Appu Pen, which is a kind of a post-disaster, post-environment disaster, post-human world that he's talking about. I don't have time today to talk about it. Maybe one day I will talk about it. And of course, you also have amazing work by our own Bengali Shorbojit Sen. Shorbojit is my dear friend, and this work called Carbon Kotha, where again, God is actually an exploitative, corporate guy who takes on a farmer. So God is literally dead, because he's now a corporate guy and he's taking a farmer on a conducted tour of Carbonopolis, a kind of a utopia which men has built, people have built through ideas of, convoluted ideas of environmental protectionism. So it's not real protection. We are not talking about real environment protection. We are actually talking of a very kind of a jargon-based protection world where nothing makes sense, at least for a farmer like Raghu, who is one of the protagonists of the work. And you also have an amazing work. Let me stop sharing. So these are the works I am talking about. I don't know whether you can see me. I hope you can see me. There is also this work called All Quiet in Bikaspuri by Sarnath Banerjee, where it's actually about water wars. It is set in Delhi, and it is actually about the water wars. The water wars are actually happening in Delhi now, of course, but this is a kind of a reimaginative mapping of the water wars that is taking place. This is, of course, The Snake and the Lotus by Appu Pen. You can have a look at this. But today, of course, I personally think, I just wanted to talk about the way I look at apocalypse, because for me, I don't think, apocalypse is imagined. It is a scenario that we may see in our real world. It may happen. So we can talk about nuclear holocaust and all that. We are surviving, right? But it is always there in our mind of what if we do not survive, or what if we survive, we are the only survivors. So apocalypse preys on the fear of being alone, or the fear of being too many people, or of being with too many people who are not talking to each other. So apocalypse is actually about the way, about the way we position ourselves without time and space. So without, of course, with bracket out time and space, if you realize what I'm trying to talk about. I could have discussed the Indian works in much detail, because I have a lot of things to tell, but I don't think it will take another hour, and doesn't feel nice, just to talk incessantly about certain things which I'm obsessed with. But I hope I've made a point about what I wanted to talk about. So what I always, it's a very basic theme, the whole talk, gibberish as it is, it can be reduced to one thing. Apocalypse is now. It is here. It is something that is happening always, and it is something that has always taken place in a way where we actually try to talk beyond our sense, a kind of a stabilized sense of time and place. This is where I end, but if there are questions, I can always take questions and maybe talk about other things as well. I don't know, Anuradha, have I taken, I'm sorry, I'm very animated. I'm always animated, as you have already known. You know me so well. So does Umkuman. But this is what I wanted to talk about. So it's not a kind of a list. And of course, Arlene has already given us a very comprehensive and a very interesting list. She has also given us a kind of a theoretical underpinning of the way, we read Apocalypse. So this is my personal take on Apocalypse and the way I view Apocalypse. So, you may actually have a, story like Snowpiercer or anything, but ultimately what is happening? What is happening with respect to what you see? That is what actually I think, and I find the answer to be, very complicated. It's happening within my mind. That is what my answer is. Okay. Anything. I mean, I have bored you people like anything,
No way, Pinaki. That was a fascinating presentation, to say the least. And I'm sure all of us here, those who are together on the, the organizers part, or those who have been listening into you, I'm sure they have all enjoyed it. And so have I, just to point out. And we do have a few questions that we would really like to take up. So can I ask them now? Can I?
Yeah, you can, of course. I mean, I'm open to questions because that is what I do. Sure. I have questions myself about my presentation. Do you believe that?
Okay, so the first question is from Paromita Dotto, and she
is a dear friend.
Okay, so
friends, what kind of setup is this?
Apocalyptic, perhaps apocalyptic.
No, not that.
Yeah. Okay. So Paromita is asking, space as it appears is extremely cubist, at least in the way you have presented it. So why does this happen?
Yeah, so I think Paramita, we studied visual, visuality in a kind of a same space, and Paramita, I think is right. Cubism, what is cubism? That's something I always wanted to answer. Cubism is actually about the way you look at space from various points of view. So cubism is actually opening up of space from multiple points of view. So when you view something from one angle or one positionality, you get an intimation of the object as it is. But whenever you talk about cubism in a much bigger way, you are actually talking about multiple points of view, looking at the same object, but reproducing it, unfortunately, because of the limitations within the very idea of a paper, of a two-dimensional object. So you actually draw something. So the cubists used to draw something on paper, which is two-dimensional, but they wanted to actually intimate us about the possibility that the object may be, the possibility that the object may have when it is mapped from various points of view. So the various points of views can actually map various ways in which the object can be seen. So time is also something like that, because the very idea of time as we have is something that we see from our point of view, and the problem is we cannot see time from beyond what we know from our intimation of time, from our understanding, sorry, not intimation, our understanding of time. So what I want to talk about, so if you actually imagine yourself to be something beyond the way you look at time, and imaginary and map imaginary points from which you can actually look at the same space from different points of view, the whole space opens up. The space doesn't seem so enclosed as it seems if you look at it from your point of view. So, the very idea of cubism is inclusivity, is also plurality. It is also the plurality. It's also the way the space opens up to something that is beyond your time and your space. It may be others' time and other space, but it is also very inclusive of the way the time and space work simultaneously on different humans at different moments in different places of time. So it's actually about opening up the space, and that is what we can do. So as writers, as creators, as artists, as comic artists, as film artists, we intend to open up spaces, and we intend to open up hidden spaces, because we look at space from our point of view, but there may be hidden spaces within our vision which may actually talk about a space from another point of view. And that is what Cubism does. So Cubism, for me, Picasso is a very interesting artist because he looks at the same thing from his vantage point, and also from numerous vantage points that he imagines, where he imagines himself to be. So he implants himself at different vantage point at different points of time in order to open up the space of the thing that he is painting. And that is when you see a cubist painting, you don't see one dimensionality at all. You actually see multi-dimensionality, almost including us with a sense of, overwhelming sensation. That's what I wanted to talk about. So I don't know whether I made sense of it. I mean, rather, I don't know. Parvita, maybe we can talk a lot after this, but I think this is what I wanted to talk about. So it's about opening up space, and it's right. The cubist vision opens up space. So does every vision. But the cubist, of course, intentionally does it, deliberately does it, self-consciously does it in a very interesting way. They, in a way, are trailblazers. Okay, others also followed their path. Yeah, but of course, now with internet, even that is becoming very, very complicated. Our sense of time and being. The very idea of hyperreality, for example, everything is becoming so complicated. And I personally feel that, the very idea of time and space as we see it, and the way, as it moves in the internet time, in the hyper real world, is also very different. And it actually gives you a sense of perspective beyond yourself. That's what I wanted to tell. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Pinaki. No, of course. Can we move on to the next question there? Okay, so this next question is by Professor Kushal Bishash from Women's Christian College.
Kushal, I know, yes. It's a small world. It's a very small world.
Indeed. Yeah. Okay, so his question is, if you were illustrating GB's letter to survivors, how differently would you have presented the landscape?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I really don't know, Kushalda, but yes, I would have done it different. I must tell you, because I love excess. I love too much of everything. I love chaos. And if you look at GB, the landscape outside is almost denuded without anything. There are some rocks which are almost scattered here and there. But for me, I would have probably, probably talked about a kind of a ghost city where nobody lives. The kind of city that I saw in China. Real world city. They were constructed, but they were completely, devoid of any people. They are there as kind of touristy landmark. I don't know what they are for. I don't know really what they are for. So if you look at that, at those, desolate malls, for example, the buildings that were never completed, for example, I would have probably set it there. That is my idea. But GB is a great artist, and for him, I think the very he tried to contrast the vacantness of the landscape outside with, not contrast, he wanted to align the vacantness of the landscape outside, which is very open, with the vacantness that is inside the bunker, that the family feels within the bunker. I feel that, and I would have done it differently. I think, I mean, if that answers your question, Kushalda, frankly, I would have done it like probably it would have been set in a desolate place where we have construction but nobody lives, kind of a place where nobody wants to live. Okay, that kind of an urban, desolate, detritus-like setup, full of urban detritus. That's what I'm trying to talk. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
No, I hope Professor Bishwash has heard you, I'm sure, because he's asked the question.
It's intimidating because Kushalda knows so much, and I really feel very small. He's somebody I look up to because he's really amazing.
Yeah. Okay, the third question, Pinaki, is from Dr. Kavita Shastri from Bangalore. And hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
so
I can.
The third question is from Dr. Kavita Shastri from Bangalore, and she's asking, how do you perceive the I and you in the time-space apocalyptic conundrum?
That's a wonderful question, and I really don't know the answer. It's very difficult. Of course, I can get back to Heidegger, the very idea of Dasein, the very idea of being, and all that, but I don't want to get into that. But what I really feel is, I really don't know. What I personally feel is that the very idea of I and you gets confused, because if you actually try to try to get the anchors off, if you lift the anchors of time and space, or at least if you create the illusion of anchor being off time and space, the very idea of I and you, it's kind of a binary that is actually based on the very existence of your being. Okay, so that somehow gets a bit confounded. So you are filled with a lot of self-doubt. You are actually filled with a lot of instability. The ground beneath your feet somehow slips out into a kind of you float in between. So I really don't know how to make sense of your identity, because the very idea of you and I is related to the very idea of identity that we actually have in time and space. But in the conundrum that of time and space that apocalyptic narratives induce, the very idea of identity actually gets much more complicated. The very idea of what I call stable identity becomes complicated. In fact, a lot of if you look at the cyborg fictions, or the cyborg narratives, you are neither I and no, the very idea of I and you somehow collapses. The human beings actually becomes what I call assemblages. Okay, a kind of machinistic assemblages which never can pin down their place in time and space. So what I want to talk about is that there is a sense of in-betweenness that happens, and that is what you try to create in the apocalyptic narrative. You try to create that vertigo of a vertigo of non-identity, non-identity, from which you cannot completely extricate yourself. You are trapped within that non-identity, because your identity is that non-identity which plays within a kind of a overlapping time and space situation. I don't know whether I'm making sense, but one of the best examples would be, look at the films, for examples. Look at the good films, apocalyptic films, and look at the series, even the popular series. The very idea of identity, the whole apocalyptic scenario becomes a kind of a metaphor for for realization of a kind of identity that you can get at the end of the film. So if you look at big disaster movies, at the end there is a sense of identity which you have lost in between. So during the time of disaster, you lost everything. You don't know what to do. You are almost floating in a sense of a surreal world where everything is falling apart, everything is falling down or floating away, whatever is happening, a lot of things is happening. And until at the end, you have a kind sense of calm where you get back your identity, where you get back your sense of self. So the whole apocalyptic scenario induces a sense of a kind of a what I call anxiety about your own identity. That's something I always feel about, and all the apocalypse, in fact, all the narratives do that, but the apocalyptic films, in a way, consciously induces that kind of narrative, induces that kind of anxiety within you, and it almost hits you every time you try to make sense of the world around you. So whether it's the the great the films that you see, all the things falling apart, and everything, collapsing, the Statue of Liberty and all getting destroyed in, thunderstorm and whatever, nuclear terror and whatever, all of them actually talks about a kind of an anxiety that you feel about yourself, about being effaced. You are no more. You may not be there. So you are here now in time and space, but maybe next day, but before also you are not there, and next day you may not be there. So the very kind of anxiety about you being there, and of course I or you being there, is something that is exploited by this genre. And this is something which is running at the deep core, at the heart of this discussion. The very idea of apocalypse is actually running at this existential anxiety of not being there yet not being yourself, being there but not being what you are, right? So that's what I actually think is happening. Yeah, so I don't know whether, yeah.
Yeah, Pinaki, I think we have time for 2 more questions and not beyond that.
You can shoot. I mean, I have a lot of time. So.
Okay. So the next one is from Orunima Shen, and this is in line, I guess, with the kind of anxiety that you were mentioning now.
Yes.
So her question is: comics are spatial depictions of tiny frames of time. So apocalypses, as you are explaining, is how the presence of the structures without meaning or content leads to paranoia of the unknown. That is what she's asking.
Amazing insight. I think that's what I'm hinting at. I think she got it, because, so it's like a, tiny time capsules being yanked out of its place within the page. So you have those time capsules. So you have these time capsules in space within the page, and you are yanking them out. So the very idea of structures without meaning and context, there is always a disconnect between the text and the context sometimes in the apocalypse narrative, because that's what you are trying to do. You are trying to confound that very idea of time and space. That's your aim. Because if you can create that, dilemma within yourself about the way time and space is spaced out within the page, about the time and space is laid out within the page, you actually, the very idea of paranoia is when you are not too sure about what to put in a page. So when you are actually looking at the blank page, it's paranoid. And when you actually have a lot of scribbles in the page, it is equally paranoid. But, the very idea of paranoia, somehow stems from the very fact that what you put in the page, those tiny things that make sense, may get disjointed, and that can be, destructured, in a metaphorical sense. I think she got it. I think she is something that she's getting. I just got something from there as well. There are many kinds of cubism. Somebody tell, yes, of course there are many kinds of cubism, but all kind of cubism opens up space in a way that, I talked about. Yes. Sorry,
Okay.
and it's like another comment. Yeah.
Okay, Pinaki, so this is the last question we'll be able to take given the time constraints we have. And this is from Dr. Nishi Pulugurtho of Prafulla
Nishidi,
Chandra College.
Yes.
Nishidi, yes.
Yes.
Okay, so Nishidi has asked a question that even I'm very keen on knowing. That is, has there been any representation of the present COVID situation in comics yet?
No, there is one person who's working on it. And of course, he lives in Calcutta, and his name is Orgho Manna. And he has actually worked on a kind of a pandemic like comics. He's doing it, and I have seen some of his work. Outside, I really don't know, but there must be some. There will be a lot, as I can understand. But of course, the very idea of disease assaulting people, creating a pandemic, is already there in comics. So if you look at Charles Burns' Black Hole, for example, you have an example of a comics where some kids are actually threatened with a kind of a pandemic-like situation. Okay, it's a kind of an AIDS-like, it was triggered by the AIDS epidemic, but it's nothing like the COVID scenario, but still it is very, very interesting. So you have those kind of novels already there, but specifically COVID, Orgo is working on one. I really don't know any others who are doing it, but definitely around the world, there will be a lot of works that will come out. Right now, nothing. But of course, we can expect this, from 1 to 2 months, I think. Because comics are very difficult to do. No? It's not easy. You cannot write suddenly, It takes time to draw and write and put into, place everything together. So I think we should give at least 2-3 months for, the real comics, the comics about COVID-19 to come out. But I'm sure, so when it comes out, I'll try to share it, because I'll definitely try to know that. I'm very, very interested in the kind of COVID-19 specific scenario comics. Really.
Yes, thank you so much, Pinaki, for patiently answering, taking so many questions and answering.
There are amazing questions. Noina, they has actually asked, more disturbing to present on paper, natural apocalypse or man-made apocalypse? What is more disturbing to present on paper, natural apocalypse or man-made apocalypse?
I haven't got the question yet. I don't know why.
Question it came out.
Okay, so yes, it is very difficult to actually keep track of the questions as well as keep track of what's happening on the screen.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, Naina. I really don't know. I think both. I guess both in their own way. So natural apocalypse, or I don't look at it at different ways. Of course, there are different scenarios. There may be different scenarios. For me, it is the discomfort that you actually create. It's a kind of paranoia that you induce that is more important. So I'm more interested in the psychological effects of the apocalypse rather than whether it's man-made or whether it's natural. So for me, it's not important. Of course, everything will have a different scenario, but for me as an artist, I think it will be equally important to see this and that But what is more important to know is the way the psychological aspects of the trauma that follows, is dealt with. So for me, that's the deep ingrained, fear of paranoia that you actually present on paper that matters. Because for us, we really, in a way, I've already told you, every creative writer always has an apocalypse going on in his head. And it is the way they sort of ink that apocalypse, in the way they put that apocalypse in paper. Because the very idea of scratching the paper, the whiteness of the paper with the pen, with the ink, with the brushstroke, you are actually destroying the pulp as you are trying to go. You are making furrows within the pulp. It's a kind of a metaphorical act of, creating something that is always brewing in your mind. It's almost like a nuclear fission that is happening. That's what I'm trying to say. So it may be a far-fetched thing, but this is what I personally feel. Yeah. So that is what I wanted to. There was also paranoia or a kind of blankness. So another person has paranoia or blankness, stupefied rather than not petrified by an unknown fear. There is another question.
Okay, Pinaki, I'm just sorry to butt in, but this is the last question you are going to take. Otherwise, it may be just, carry on forever.
We can carry on till midnight. We cannot do that. So we cannot. We have already bored people to death. So let's not bore them further. Really don't. So I really don't. No. Paranoia or blankness, again, difficult to tell. It's a mixture of both, I guess. Again, very difficult to quantify these things. So maybe what we talk about paranoia may be a sense of blankness. And what we think of blankness is a bit of a paranoia. So, the very idea of getting stupefied or petrified doesn't matter. The disturbance matters. The way you get disturbed, the way you get agitated, the way you get really walked up in, doing something, that matters. And that is what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry. I mean, Anuradha, I've taken a lot of time. I've already bored
people. It's okay. No, there's no question of being bored. We would have loved to listen to more. Only, we do have to wrap up because we have 2 more presentations tomorrow and the webinar.
I am waiting to listen to Madhujadi and Sudebda again.
Yes. So that is the note I wanted to end this session with. Thank you so much, both Arlene and Pinaki. We've had a wonderful day.
I must thank Arlene for a wonderful presentation, because she, in a way, made it easier for me, because she talked about everything I wanted to talk about. She summarized, and she also made, so important references to the theorists that have walked on the very idea.
The theoretical underpinnings, yes,
of
course.
Absolutely indebted to her, because she set the tone for this discussion, because this is much more kind of a personal take on my kind of artistic take on the way I look at apocalypse, rather than a more comprehensive take. So I personally feel indebted to Arlene for really paving the way for me to talk in a very easy way. Thank you.
Thank you. The same.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's time to call it a day now. And thank you for all the speakers, and thank you all the listeners, all the people who posted questions so very kindly and made this such a wonderful interactive session. We hope to see you again tomorrow, the same time at 3:15 p.m. sharp. And
yes.
We have 2 more speakers lined up. Professor Madhuja Mukherjee of the Department of Film Studies, Jadavpur University, and Professor Shudev Pratim Basu from Vishwabharati University, Shantiniketan. So let's hope that we have an equally intriguing day tomorrow. And on that note, I think it's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much once again. Thank you all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.